There was a time, not so long ago in the grand scale of Earth's memory, when Australia looked nothing like it does today. The coastlines were different. The rivers ran in places you would never expect. The deserts had not yet fully claimed the interior, and the sea, the ancient patient sea, was still far below where it sits now, waiting at the edges of a land that stretched wider and flatter than anything modern maps can show you. 12,000 years ago, something began. Not suddenly, not with a single crash or wave, but slowly and then faster and then with a kind of inevitability that no creature on that ancient continent could have fully understood. The ice was melting, oceans were rising, and an entire world was being swallowed, shore by shore, over generations, over centuries, over the long quiet grief of a people who watched their homeland disappear beneath water they had never asked for. This is that story. Tonight, we are going to move through it together, slowly and gently, the way water moves through flat country, finding every low place and filling it with patience. There is no rush here. These events happened across thousands of years. We have all the time we need. If you're settling in for sleep right now, let your body go heavy. Let your breath slow down. The story will carry you. You do not need to hold it. Just listen, and let the words wash over you the way water once washed over the old shores of an ancient continent that no one alive has ever seen with their own eyes. Before we go further, if you find this kind of slow, deep history comforting for sleep, consider subscribing. New sleep histories arrive every week, and each one is made to carry you gently into the night. Now, let us begin. Number 1, the world before the flood, when Australia was twice the size it is today. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand what existed. Stand in your imagination at the edge of what is now the Arafura Sea, the body of water that separates northern Australia from New Guinea. In the world of 12,000 years ago, there is no sea here. You are standing on a broad, flat plain. Grasslands stretch out in front of you. There are freshwater lakes glinting in the distance. Animals you have no name for move through the tall grass. The air smells of dry earth and something green, something alive, something that will not exist for much longer but does not know that yet. This plain has a name now, given to it by the scientists and geographers who pieced it together from ocean floor sediments and ancient landforms and the stories of the people who lived on it. They call it the Sahul Shelf, and in the time we are talking about, roughly 20,000 years ago at its most exposed, this shelf connected Australia to New Guinea in one enormous continuous landmass. The continent was not just bigger to the north, it was bigger in every direction. To the south, what is now the Bass Strait, that churning stretch of ocean between mainland Australia and Tasmania, was dry land. You could walk from one to the other. The Tasmanian landmass that existed then was enormous, far larger than the island we know today, with rivers and forests and high cold plateaus that supported life in ways the island Tasmania never quite matched again after the waters rose. To the northwest, the continental shelf extended hundreds of kilometers beyond the modern coastline. There were river valleys out there now, sitting under 60, 80, 100 meters of water. There were campsites and tool-making spots and places where people gathered around fires, all of it now hidden under the sea, muffled and dark and slowly dissolving into sediment. Geologists and archaeologists have a word for this larger landmass. They call it Sahul. And Sahul was, at its greatest extent, roughly 50% larger than modern Australia. It was one of the biggest landmasses on Earth, a continent of extraordinary diversity, from tropical rainforests in the north to cold highland tundra in what is now the deep ocean, from vast internal lakes to coastal wetlands of almost incomprehensible richness. The people who lived on Sahul had been there for a long time, a very long time. The oldest evidence of human presence on the continent dates to at least 65,000 years ago, and some researchers believe the true date may be older still. By the time the floods came, these people had been walking on this land for 50, 60, perhaps 65,000 years. They knew every river, every escarpment, every seasonal waterhole. They had songs for places that no longer exist, ceremonies for landscapes now lying beneath the sea. Let that settle for a moment. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia carry within their cultures, within their stories and their songs, the memory of a world that the rest of humanity has almost entirely forgotten. A world that predates the pyramids by 50,000 years. A world that was swallowed by water so long ago that in most human traditions there would be no living memory of it at all. But there is. We will come back to that. For now, just rest with the image of it. That enormous continent, those wide flat plains full of ancient grass, those lakes in the interior that would dry to nothing over the following millennia, that land bridge to New Guinea, walked over and back by generations so numerous no count could ever be made, It existed. It was real. People lived there and loved there and died there and were buried in ground that is now ocean floor. And then the ice began to melt. Number 2, the ice age that made it all possible, and the long cold world before the waters came. To understand the flood, you have to understand the cold. The world, 12 to 20,000 years ago, was locked in what scientists call the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age. The planet was profoundly colder than it is today. Not uniformly colder, not in every place to the same degree, but colder in ways that cascaded through every system on Earth and reshaped the surface of the planet almost beyond recognition. In the northern hemisphere, ice sheets kilometers thick covered what is now Canada, Scandinavia, much of Britain, and large parts of northern Europe and Asia. The weight of this ice was so immense that it actually pressed the land down, bending the crust of the Earth itself. Sea levels worldwide were dramatically lower than today, because so much of the planet's water was locked up in ice rather than flowing free in the oceans. How much lower? Estimates vary by region and time period, but in the waters around Australia, sea levels at the height of the last glacial maximum were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. That is the height of a 40-story building. This is the single most important number for understanding what Australia once was and what it became. With sea levels that far below their modern position, the continental shelves, those broad, shallow underwater platforms that ring most landmasses, were exposed. They became land, and around Australia, those continental shelves were, in many places, extraordinarily wide, especially to the north, where the Sahul shelf stretched out for hundreds of kilometres, and to the south, where the Bass Strait connection between Australia and Tasmania sat on a relatively shallow shelf that became perfectly walkable land when the seas pulled back. But the Ice Age was not just about ice and lower sea levels. The climate itself was different. Australia during the last glacial maximum was drier than it is today, in most regions significantly so. The Great Interior, which we now think of as harsh and arid, was even harsher then. Vast dune fields shifted across areas that today support scrubby vegetation. The wind was stronger. Dust storms that modern Australians would find staggering swept across the continent for days at a time. The red dust of the interior is, in part, a legacy of that Ice Age wind. And yet there was water too. In places it no longer exists. Lake Mungo, in the dry interior of what is now New South Wales, was a full and living lake during the Ice Age. It was part of a vast network of connected lakes and wetlands called the Willandra Lakes System. People lived on its shores, they fished its waters, they left behind evidence of their lives, including, most famously, the remains of individuals who were buried with great care, evidence of ritual and ceremony, evidence of a rich and complex inner life. Lake Mungo Man, whose remains were found in 1974, was buried approximately 42,000 years ago. He was the oldest known human on the continent at the time of his discovery, and he was buried in what, by the standards of that age, was a place of abundance, a lake in the interior, a place with fish and birds and the soft green margins that drew animals and people alike. That lake is dry now, has been for a very long time. The water that filled it moved elsewhere or evaporated into the increasing aridity, as the Ice Age progressed and then as the world warmed. But during the long cold millennia before the floods came, Australia was a continent of contradictions. Drier in the interior than today in many ways, yes, but with coastal shelves full of rivers and wetlands, with sea levels so low that the northern coast was far from where it is now, and the land that connected Australia to New Guinea was a broad, inhabited plain. The people of Sahul adapted to all of it. They were extraordinarily flexible, these ancient Australians. They had to be. 65,000 years of survival on a continent that throws heat and drought and flood and fire at everything that lives on it tends to produce a deep, bone-level adaptability. They moved through a continent that was always changing, always testing them, and they always found a way, until the ice really started melting. Then things changed in ways that even 65,000 years of wisdom could not entirely prepare you for. Number 3, Meltwater Pulse, 1A, the first great surge, when the ocean jumped and the world held its breath. Around 14,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened to the world's oceans. For thousands of years, the ice had been melting gradually, slowly, the way ice always melts when the climate shifts. Sea levels had been rising, but at a pace that, while meaningful over generations, was not catastrophic in any single human lifetime. You could feel it if you paid attention. The beach your grandparents described was not quite the beach you knew. The sandbar your parents remembered was now underwater at high tide, but the change was measured in human generations, not in human years. And then it was not. Scientists studying ancient ocean sediments and coral reef formations have found evidence of a dramatic acceleration in sea level rise that occurred roughly 14,000 to 13,500 years ago. This event has a name. It is called Meltwater Pulse 1A, and it was, by any measure, one of the most dramatic sea level events of the past 100,000 years. During Meltwater Pulse 1A, sea levels around the world rose by an estimated 14 to 18 meters in the span of just 500 years. Some models suggest it may have happened even faster than that, 14 to 18 meters in 500 years. That is roughly 3 to 4 centimeters per year on average. But averages can be misleading. There may have been decades within that period where the rise was faster still, punctuated by pulses and surges as massive ice sheet collapses sent walls of meltwater pouring into the ocean. Think about what this means for a flat coastal plain. When sea levels rise by even 1 meter over a flat shelf, the ocean can advance many kilometers inland. The broader and flatter the shelf, the greater the horizontal extent of the flooding for any given vertical rise in sea level. And the Sahul Shelf, the broad, flat platform that surrounded much of ancient Australia, was extraordinarily susceptible to exactly this kind of rapid horizontal flooding. Where the ocean had been a distant thing, known about, crossed occasionally, a boundary of the known world, it suddenly began moving, not slowly, not over decades. By the time a child born at the start of a particularly active flooding decade reached middle age, the coastline might have moved kilometers from where it was when they were born. There is a concept in geology called transgression, marine transgression. It refers to the advance of the sea over land, and it is usually a slow affair, measured in millions of years. But during Meltwater Pulse 1A, transgression happened at a speed that was, in geological terms, almost instantaneous. In human terms, it was fast enough to be disorienting. The low-lying plains to the north of Australia, where the Sahul Shelf stretched toward New Guinea, would have been among the most severely affected. Flatland floods fast. Water finds the low places first, then the medium places, then eventually everything. Rivers that had flowed freely across that plain now found themselves struggling against the encroaching sea. Saltwater pushed upstream into freshwater systems. Wetlands that had been freshwater became brackish, then fully marine. The animals that depended on those freshwater systems either moved or died, and the people who lived there moved with them. This is the important thing to hold in your mind as you drift towards sleep tonight. The people of Sahul were not passive victims of the flood. They were movers. They were adapters. They had been moving and adapting for 60,000 years before the first great pulse of water arrived, and they continued to move and adapt as it came. But moving is not without cost. When you move, you leave behind the graves of your ancestors. You leave behind the places where your ceremonies are performed, the sacred sites tied to the land by stories that go back further than memory. You leave behind the country that is, in the deepest sense, a part of who you are. For Aboriginal Australians, the relationship between people and country is not metaphorical. It is not poetic in the way we might use that word casually. Country is a living presence. Country holds the bones of the dead, the dreaming tracks of the ancestors, the spiritual geography of an entire people. To be separated from country is not merely to be displaced. It is to be cut from something fundamental. And as Meltwater Pulse 1A pushed the sea across the Sahul Shelf, the people of Northern Australia were being cut from country, not all at once, not even quickly by human standards, but steadily, inexorably, generation by generation. The country they knew was disappearing underwater. They would have watched it happen, they would have told their children about it, their children would have told their children, and so on, down through the long chain of generations, until 12,000 years later, those stories would still be there, shaped and carried in forms that outsiders would only begin to understand in the 20th century. Number 4, the drowning of the northern plains, how a land bridge became the Arafura Sea. Let us go north. Let us stand on the Sahul Plain, the broad connection between Australia and New Guinea, and watch what happens as the waters come. At the height of the last glacial maximum, this plain was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of land, relatively flat, threaded with rivers, dotted with lakes and seasonal wetlands. It was not a single landscape, but a mosaic of them. There were areas of dry grassland, areas of more tropical vegetation near the freshwater systems, elevated ridges that broke the flatness and created microclimates of their own. People had lived here for a very long time. Archaeological evidence from both the Australian side and the New Guinea side of this ancient landscape suggests continuous human habitation going back tens of thousands of years. These people were not isolated. They moved back and forth across the plain. They traded, they intermarried, they shared stories and technologies and ideas. The people of what is now New Guinea and the people of what is now Australia were, in a very real sense, one people, divided only by the gradual categorizations that language and distance produce over generations. As the climate shifted and the ice began to melt, the great rivers of the Sahul plain began to change. The rivers that had flowed northward across the plain toward the ancient shore found that shore moving toward them. Instead of flowing to the sea, they began to meet the sea coming to them. This is one of the stranger aspects of marine transgression in flat country. The rivers do not simply disappear, they fight the sea. For a time, freshwater and saltwater contest the same channels, the same estuaries, the same valleys. The river pushes out, the sea pushes in, and the result is something in between, a shifting, brackish frontier that is neither one thing nor the other. Then, gradually, the sea wins. The saltwater pushes further and further upstream. The freshwater fish die or retreat. The plants that lived in freshwater margins either adapt or retreat as well. The land that was once river floodplain becomes tidal flat. The tidal flat becomes shallow bay. The shallow bay deepens as the sea continues to rise. And somewhere beneath all that water are the campsites. The middens full of freshwater shellfish. The hearths where fires were lit and food was cooked. The places where someone sat once and watched the sun go down over a world that will not come back. The Arafura Sea, which now separates Australia from New Guinea by roughly 500 kilometers of open water, did not always exist. It was created incrementally over thousands of years as meltwater from distant glaciers poured into oceans that grew and grew until they swallowed that ancient plain. The process was not uniform. It was not linear. There were periods of faster rise and periods of relative stability. During the stable periods, people could adapt, find new equilibria, establish new territories on the retreating shore. During the faster rises, the adaptation would have been more urgent, more disorienting, more deeply felt. There is a concept that archaeologists and anthropologists use when discussing the cultural impacts of sea level rise on ancient peoples. They call it landscape memory. The idea is that cultures carry memories of landscapes within their traditions, their stories, their ceremonies, even long after those landscapes have changed or disappeared. And the evidence from northern Australia suggests that the people of the Sahul Plain did indeed carry such memories. The story of a great flood, a rising sea that swallowed land and forced people to new ground, appears in the oral traditions of many Aboriginal Australian groups, particularly in the north and northwest. These stories have been studied seriously by geologists and archaeologists in recent decades, and what they have found is striking. The details of the flooding described in many of these traditions, the direction the water came from, the way it covered certain kinds of country, the time frame implied by the genealogies attached to the stories, often correspond with remarkable accuracy to what the geological record shows about sea level rise in those specific regions. We will come back to these stories in more detail later. For now, just know that the drowning of the northern plains was not forgotten. It was remembered and carried and shaped into something that could be passed from voice to ear across uncounted generations. That is a kind of miracle when you think about it. Number 5, what lived on the drowned land, the animals of a lost continent. The flora and fauna of ancient Sahul were, in many ways, stranger and richer than what exists on the continent today. Australia is already remarkable for its wildlife. The continent's long isolation has produced an array of animals found nowhere else on Earth, marsupials of every variety, egg-laying mammals, birds of extraordinary color and sound, reptiles that seem almost prehistoric in their ancient forms. But the Sahul of 12,000 years ago was even more extraordinary than the Australia we know, because it still had megafauna. Megafauna. The word refers to very large animals, and Australia once had them in abundance. Diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros, was the largest marsupial ever to have existed on Earth. It browsed on tough vegetation in the interior and around the edges of wetlands, and it left behind bones that sometimes surface from lake sediments or eroding hillsides, mute testimony to a world before. Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, stood 3 meters tall and could reach vegetation that no modern kangaroo can access. Its feet were different from modern kangaroos, more hoof-like, adapted for the harder, drier ground of the glacial interior. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, was a predator of formidable power. It had the strongest bite relative to body size of any mammal, living or extinct. It climbed trees, it ambushed prey from above. The people of ancient Sahul would have known it, would have been wary of it, might have hunted it, or been hunted by it in turn. Genyornis, a giant flightless bird, stood nearly 2 meters tall and was built like a tank. Its eggs were the size of a small melon, and there is evidence that ancient Australians collected those eggs, cooked them, feasted on them. All of these creatures, and many others, lived on the Sahul of the Ice Age. By the time the floods reached their peak around 12,000 years ago, most of them were gone. The megafauna extinction of Australia is one of the most debated topics in paleontology, a complex argument about whether it was human hunting, climate change, or some combination of both that drove these extraordinary animals to their end. What is clear is that the rising seas of the flood period contributed to the pressure. As coastal plains were swallowed, as river systems were disrupted, as the freshwater wetlands that supported many large herbivores turned brackish or simply disappeared under the ocean, the available habitat for these animals shrank. For species that were already stressed by hunting pressure or by the drying that accompanied the transition out of the Ice Age, losing vast areas of productive coastal habitat to rising seas would have been one pressure too many. The drowned lands of the Sahul Shelf, those hundreds of thousands of square kilometers now lying under the Arafura, Timor, and Coral Seas, were among the most ecologically productive parts of the continent. River deltas, coastal wetlands, estuarine systems, these are some of the richest environments on Earth in terms of the variety and density of life they support. When those environments disappeared under the sea, the animals that depended on them either moved inland, which many could not do effectively, because inland habitat was drying and hardening in the post-glacial world, or they were gone. And so, as the waters rose and the ancient coast retreated, the animals of Sahul retreated with it, or they did not. The people watched this too. They saw the diprotodon herds dwindling. They saw the monstrous birds becoming rarer. They adapted their hunting, their ceremonies, their stories. Some of those stories may still be there, encoded in traditions about great animals that once lived and now are gone, remembered by name and described by behavior and the oral histories of people whose ancestors watched them disappear. The natural world of ancient Sahul was a collaboration between environment and animal and human that we have only begun to understand, and most of it is now underwater. Rest with that for a moment. All that life, all that complexity beneath the sea. Not gone, exactly. Still there, in a sense, just hidden. Number 6. The Bass Strait crossing when Tasmania was not an island. Turn your attention south now, to the place where the cold seas of the Southern Ocean push up against the edge of Australia. This is where the Bass Strait sits today. That stretch of frequently stormy water between the southern tip of Victoria and the northern coast of Tasmania. There is no crossing it casually now. It is wide enough and rough enough to command respect, even from modern ships. But 12,000 years ago, it did not exist. The land bridge between mainland Australia and Tasmania was not a narrow, precarious thing. It was substantial. The continental shelf in that region is relatively shallow, meaning that even modest sea level drops expose large areas of land. At the height of the last glacial maximum, the Bass Strait was not just dry, it was a broad and varied landscape, many hundreds of kilometers wide, that connected the southern tip of the continent to what was then a much larger Tasmanian landmass. People walked across that land. The archaeological evidence shows human presence in Tasmania dating to at least 40,000 years ago, meaning that at some point in the past, people crossed from what was then mainland Australia to the extended Tasmanian landscape and established themselves there. They did not come by boat. The technology and evidence for open water crossing to Tasmania does not appear in the record for that period. They walked, they followed the land south, and the land took them there. Tasmania during the Ice Age was cold, genuinely cold by Australian standards. Parts of it were covered by small glaciers. The vegetation was often heath and grassland rather than the cool temperate rainforest that cloaks much of the island today. It was a demanding environment, and the people who lived there adapted to its demands, developing stone tool technologies and cultural practices that reflected the particular challenges of living in a cold, remote, resource-rich but demanding landscape. They were by any measure a remarkably skilled and resilient people. And then the land bridge began to flood. The flooding of the Bass Strait would have been one of the most significant events in the cultural and demographic history of southern Australia. As the seas rose and the land between Tasmania and the mainland became first a coastal wetland, then a series of islands, then a shallow sea, then the deep and storm-prone strait it is today, the people of Tasmania found themselves separated from the rest of the continent. This separation was not instant. It happened over centuries. There may have been periods of seasonal crossing when sea levels happened to stabilize, and sandbars or chains of islands made the journey possible on calm days with simple watercraft. But eventually the water was too deep and too wide and too rough for the technology available, and Tasmania was truly cut off. And so the Tasmanians became, in a sense, a world unto themselves. For 10,000 years or more, they developed in isolation, their culture and technology evolving along its own particular path, shaped by the cold climate, the rich forests and coasts, and the absence of the cross-cultural exchange that continued on the mainland. When European ships arrived in the late 18th century, the Aboriginal Tasmanians they encountered were people whose culture had been developing independently for longer than almost any isolated population on Earth. The flooding of the Bass Strait was not just a geographical event, it was a cultural fracture, a separation that would shape two distinct streams of human development across the length of what was once a single connected landscape. For those settling into sleep tonight, there is something almost meditative in this. The idea that the shapes of the world we live in, the islands and the seas and the coastlines we take as given, are not permanent. They are temporary arrangements of water and land, shifting over thousands of years, swallowing some things and revealing others, always in motion, always changing, even when they feel as solid and eternal as stone. The Bass Strait is just water now, but underneath it there is land, there are river valleys. There are the places where people once walked and built fires and looked up at the cold southern stars. It is all still there, just deep. Number 7. Voices from the Flood, what the ancient stories say. This is perhaps the most extraordinary chapter in the story of the Australian flood, and the one that deserves the most careful attention. For most of human history, the idea that any oral tradition could reliably preserve detailed information across thousands of years was considered implausible. Memory degrades, stories change. The telephone game of oral transmission across generations was assumed to inevitably distort and transform until original meaning was lost. This was the dominant view in Western scholarship for a very long time. And then researchers began actually comparing the specific details of Aboriginal Australian oral traditions about floods and rising seas against the geological record of sea level change in Australia. And what they found challenged the assumption profoundly. Linguist and anthropologist Nicholas Reed and geologist Patrick Nunn published a landmark study in 2016 that systematically examined Aboriginal Australian stories about sea level rise. They identified more than 20 distinct traditions from different coastal regions of Australia that described with considerable geographical specificity the flooding of land that is now beneath the sea. They compared the landscape details in these stories with what is known about the bathymetry, the underwater topography of the areas in question. They looked at the directions from which the water came, the kinds of landscape that were described as being flooded, the surviving high ground described as refuge. The correlations they found were striking. Stories from the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land described the flooding of a vast plain to the north. The geology confirms a large, low-lying plain in that area, now under the Arafura Sea. Stories from the people of the Spencer Gulf region in South Australia described a land that stretched out to where certain distant features, now visible only at low tide, once formed part of a connected landscape. The bathymetry confirms that the Spencer Gulf area did indeed contain substantial dry land at the height of the last glacial maximum, now lying under relatively shallow water. A story from the Narunga people of York Peninsula in South Australia describes the creation of what is now Gulf St. Vincent, the large bay on the western side of the Fleurieu Peninsula. The story tells of a time before the bay existed, when the land was connected and the sea came and created the bay. The geological evidence suggests the basin of Gulf St. Vincent was indeed dry land during the last glacial maximum and was flooded as sea levels rose. These are not vague stories about water and change. They are geographically specific accounts that correctly identify which areas were flooded, from which direction the water came, and in some cases, what kind of landscape existed before the flooding. The level of geological accuracy in traditions that may be 10,000 years old or more is, to put it plainly, astonishing. Reed and Nunn concluded that these traditions represent genuine cultural memories of sea level rise following the end of the last ice age. They are, in their estimation, among the oldest reliably preserved oral traditions in the world, potentially stretching back 7,000 to 12,000 years. Think about that. 7,000 to 12,000 years of faithful oral transmission through all the turbulence of human history, all the challenges and changes that those millennia brought to the peoples of Australia. The tradition held, The story of the flood that changed their world was considered important enough, sacred enough, precisely accurate enough to be passed from mouth to ear and back to mouth across hundreds of generations without losing its core geographical truth. This is what happens when a culture understands that its history is not a curiosity, but a survival manual. When the people who experienced the flood understood that the knowledge of where the water came from and where the safe ground was might matter again someday. To descendants they would never know, in circumstances they could not predict. They encoded that knowledge in forms designed to last, in stories, in songs, in ceremony. The Aboriginal Australian peoples preserved the memory of the greatest flooding event in human experience since the end of the Ice Age. They did it without writing, without maps in any Western sense, without the technology we think of as necessary for long-term record keeping. They did it with voice and memory and the sacred obligation to pass on what matters to those who come after. It is one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in human history. Number 8. The slow grief of losing country, how culture responds to environmental change over generations. We have talked about the physical facts of the flood, the meters of sea level rise, the kilometers of flooded coastline, the animals displaced and lost. But now let us sit for a moment with something softer and harder at the same time. The human experience of watching your world change in ways you cannot stop. Because that is what the flood was, for the people who lived through it. Not an event you could prepare for and then recover from. A long, slow, relentless change that lasted for thousands of years. Centuries of watching the shore retreat, of moving inland, generation by generation, of establishing new camps on ground that your parents had never seen, while the ground your grandparents knew slowly disappeared beneath salt water. How do you hold the grief of something that takes thousands of years to happen? One answer is, you turn it into story. There is a tradition in many Aboriginal Australian cultures of what might be called landscape song. Compositions that encode geographic information in musical form, that map the features of country in sequences of melody and lyric that can be followed like a route. The songlines that Bruce Chatwin wrote about in his famous book, though Chatwin understood them imperfectly and described them with a tourist's broad brush, are real things, real living traditions that continue to this day. And some of those songs describe country that no longer exists, or exists only in fragments. They describe coastlines that the sea has taken, rivers that no longer flow, hills that are now islands. This is cultural memory encoded in a living form. The song keeps the lost country present. It preserves not just the memory of where things were, but the emotional relationship to those places. The feeling of a particular river bend at evening. The quality of light on a certain plain. The smell of a particular kind of vegetation in a particular season. These things were altered or lost. The flood changed them. But the song holds something of them still, the way a pressed flower holds something of the living bloom. Not quite alive in the same way anymore, but not quite gone either. There is also evidence that the flood drove significant cultural innovation. As coastal communities were pushed inland, they came into contact with inland communities. New social arrangements had to be negotiated. New territories had to be understood. New trade relationships had to be established. The breaking of old certainties often produces new creativity, a kind of forced adaptation that generates solutions you would never have found if things had stayed the same. The extraordinary diversity of Aboriginal Australian cultures and languages, perhaps the greatest per capita linguistic diversity of any continent in the world, more than 250 distinct language groups at the time of European contact, may in part reflect this long history of adaptation and displacement. Communities pushed by the flood into new territories, mixing with existing populations, creating new blends, new negotiations, new cultural forms. The flood was not simply a tragedy. It was also, in a certain light, a kind of terrible creative force. It broke old arrangements and made space for new ones. The grief was real, and so was the adaptation. As you lie in the darkness right now, consider the resilience of that. 65,000 years on a continent that constantly tested its inhabitants. And when the greatest test of all came, when the sea rose and the country disappeared, they adapted. They carried the stories, they made new songs, they found new country and learned to love it. They survived, and their descendants are still here. Number 9, what the ocean floor remembers, the archaeology of the drowned lands. There is a field of study that has grown considerably in the past few decades, driven partly by improved underwater survey technology, and partly by a growing recognition that much of the human story on this planet is not on land at all. It is underwater. on the continental shelves that were once coastal plains, on the seafloor that was once river delta and wetland and campsite and burial ground. This field is called underwater or maritime archaeology, and in Australia it is beginning to produce extraordinary results. The continental shelf around Australia, particularly to the north and northwest, is now known to contain a vast archaeological record. Tools made of stone have been found on the seafloor in the Dampier Archipelago region. Fossilized bone from extinct megafauna has been recovered from the seabed in several areas. In some places, the ancient riverbeds that once drained the Sahul plain are visible in the underwater topography, the branching patterns of ancient drainage systems preserved in the sediment on the ocean floor. The challenge is access. Underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive. Many of the most archaeologically promising areas are in deep water, beyond the easy reach of divers, requiring sophisticated remotely operated vehicles and precise navigation technology to survey effectively. The sediment that covers the ancient landscape is, in places, many meters thick, built up over 12,000 years of ocean floor deposition. Finding the archaeological layer beneath that sediment requires careful, targeted survey. But when it is found, what it reveals is remarkable. In the waters off the Kimberley coast of northwestern Australia, surveys have identified ancient river channel systems that connected the modern rivers of that region to the sea when sea levels were much lower. These channel systems are, in a sense, the underwater skeletons of rivers that flowed across the Sahul Shelf, and where rivers flowed, people gathered. The water sources, the food resources, the navigational corridors that rivers provided in a flat landscape, all of these would have drawn people to the river margins. The campsites along those ancient rivers are now underwater. Their stone tools, their hearths, their middens of shellfish and animal bone, all of it rests on the seabed, in the dark, slowly being covered by sediment, or in some cases being eroded by currents and scattered across the ocean floor. Every once in a while, a stone tool surfaces on a beach somewhere in northern Australia, rolled in by a wave, tumbled up from the shallow seafloor where currents have exposed the ancient land surface. Someone picks it up and looks at it. They might not know what they're holding. They might toss it back into the surf. But what they held for a moment was a message from a person who lived on that beach when it was not a beach but dry land, when the sea was far away, when the world was cold and full of animals we have no names for anymore. Those messages are everywhere. We just do not know how to read most of them yet. The underwater archaeology of Australia's drowned coastlines is in its early stages. The technology is improving. The understanding of where to look and what to look for is developing. And as it does, the picture of ancient Sahul will become clearer. The people who lived on that lost continent will become more real to us. Their campsites and their tools and the bones of the animals they ate will tell us stories that no oral tradition has preserved. Details of daily life, of diet, of technology, of the particular textures of existence on a coast that no longer exists. It is slow work, patient work, the kind of work that suits this quiet hour, this drift towards sleep. The careful, methodical uncovering of things that have been hidden for a very long time. Number 10, the middle period, when the sea rested and the people breathed. Not all of the flooding happened at the same rate. The story of sea level rise after the last ice age is not a single smooth curve, but a complicated, irregular shape, with periods of rapid rise punctuated by periods of relative stability. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, there were intervals when sea level rise slowed significantly. The great meltwater pulses, those rapid surges caused by major ice sheet collapses, had their counterparts in slower periods when the remaining ice sheets shrank more gradually, and the sea rose correspondingly more slowly. For the people of the Australian coast, these slower periods were breathing space. Not permanent safety, but time to adapt, time to understand new coastlines, time to establish new camps on what felt like stable ground, to learn the new fishing spots and the new seasonal patterns of birds and mammals on retreating shores. During these stable periods, Aboriginal Australians developed and refined the technology and knowledge systems that allowed them to thrive in coastal environments. The rich middens, those accumulations of shellfish and animal bone that mark the places where people ate and lived along the coast, date heavily to these periods of relative stability. People could not invest in building middens, in establishing long-term camps with all the cultural infrastructure that implied if they expected the coast to shift again within a generation. When things stabilized, they invested. They built knowledge of places. They named the reefs and the rocks and the seasonal aggregations of particular fish. They developed ceremony tied to specific coastal features. They created, in short, the deep, layered relationship with particular pieces of country that characterizes Indigenous Australian coastal cultures to this day. And then the sea would rise again, another pulse, another surge, another retreat from the shore. This rhythm, stability and flooding, played out over thousands of years and shaped the cultures of coastal Australia in profound ways. It produced a particular kind of resilience, a knowledge that the settled times would not last forever, but that adaptation was possible. That new country could be learned and loved. It produced a flexibility about attachment to specific places, a willingness to move when the land demanded it, while still maintaining the deep cultural connections to country that distinguish Aboriginal Australian relationships with landscape. It also produced, scholars have suggested, a particular relationship with time, a long view, an understanding that the world changes on timescales longer than a single human life, or a single generation, or even a single age. The Aboriginal Australian sense of deep time, of a past that stretches back far beyond individual memory, and a future that extends far beyond individual concern, may be in part a product of living through thousands of years of environmental change that required exactly that kind of temporal perspective. When your culture carries the memory of a flood that happened 10,000 years ago, you understand in your bones that the world is old and that it changes. When your ceremonies include the names of places that no longer exist on dry land, you understand that the present arrangement of things is temporary. When your stories describe the sea coming to swallow land that your ancestors walked on, you understand that the coastline is not permanent. This is, arguably, a form of wisdom that modern industrial civilization is only now beginning to acquire. The understanding that the relationship between land and sea is dynamic. The coasts can be lost, that the world your grandparents knew may not be the world your grandchildren inherit. The people of ancient Sahul had that understanding built into the deepest structures of their cultural memory. They had earned it the hard way, by living through it. Rest gently with that. The wisdom of people who learned, over thousands of years, to hold the world lightly while loving it deeply. Number 11. The rise of the reef. How the Great Barrier Reef grew from the flood. Something beautiful came from the flooding. Not only loss, also this. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the most extraordinary ecosystems on Earth. The largest living structure visible from space, the home of thousands of species of coral and fish and mollusk and crustacean and sea turtle, did not exist as we know it before the flood. The continental shelf off the coast of northeastern Australia, which is now covered by the warm, shallow waters of the Coral Sea, was dry land for most of the last ice age. The platforms and ridges that now support coral growth were above the waterline. Corals cannot grow on land. They need water, shallow, warm, clear salt water, with the right chemistry and the right light and the right flow. As the seas rose following the end of the last ice age, they gradually inundated those platforms. The water crept across the dry shelf, slowly, and then faster during the meltwater pulses, until it covered the rocky platforms that would become the foundation of the reef. And then the corals came. Coral reefs are built slowly, incrementally, over thousands of years. Each individual coral polyp is a small animal that secretes a calcium carbonate skeleton. When it dies, its skeleton remains and new polyps grow on top of it. Over centuries and millennia, these skeletons accumulate into the great structures we call reefs. The growth rate of coral varies by species and conditions, but even fast-growing corals add only a few centimeters per year. The scale of the Great Barrier Reef, stretching for more than 2,300 kilometers along the Queensland coast, represents thousands of years of accumulated coral growth. That growth began in earnest as the rising seas of the post-glacial period flooded the continental shelf and provided the warm, shallow habitat that corals require. In a very real sense, the Great Barrier Reef is a monument to the flood, a living structure built on the bones of a drowned landscape growing in the water that swallowed the ancient coastal plains. The Aboriginal peoples of coastal Queensland, the Yithuwara, the Worgame, the Kuku-Yalanji and many others, have lived alongside this reef for as long as the reef has existed. Their knowledge of it is, by definition, knowledge that developed as the reef itself developed. The names they gave to its features, the stories they told about its origins, the ceremonies tied to its creatures, all of this grew alongside the reef, shaped by the same historical process. Some traditions from this region describe the period when the reef was young, when the sea was still rising, and the floor of the shallow coral areas was not fully submerged. They describe a time when you could walk out to places that are now always underwater. This tracks, with remarkable precision, the geological record of the reef's development. The reef that exists today is, therefore, both a wonder of the natural world and a library of human experience. Its growth layers encode the history of sea level rise and the chemistry of ancient corals that can be dated and analyzed. Its edges follow the contours of ancient geography, and the people who live beside it carry traditions that describe its creation. There is something deeply moving about this. A vast flooding produced over thousands of years one of the most extraordinary ecosystems on Earth. The drowned land became the living reef, loss transformed over millennia into something new and astonishing. The world does this. It takes what was and makes something different. Not better or worse in any absolute sense, just different. The reef is not a consolation for the Sahul Plain, but it is real and it is extraordinary, and it grew from the same water that swallowed the world that came before it. Number 12. The final rise, when the sea reached its modern height and the world settled. By around 7,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. The sea stopped rising. Not completely, not instantly, but the great engines of sea level change, the massive ice sheets of the northern hemisphere, had largely melted. The Antarctic ice sheet, which stores by far the most water on Earth, was changing more slowly. And so the relentless rise that had characterized the previous 12 to 13,000 years began to slow, and then, in most regions of the world, to stop. The sea had reached roughly its modern level. The coastlines that exist today, the ones we draw on maps, the ones that nations define themselves by, the ones that cities are built upon, settled into something approaching their current form. But around Australia, the transition was not quite so simple. The Australian continent is geologically complex, with different regions behaving differently as they adjusted to the removal of ice from the northern hemisphere. Some parts of the Australian coast experienced a sea level that was actually higher than today during the early Holocene, the period from roughly 10,000 to 5,000 years ago. Coastal features from this period, raised beach ridges and old dune systems, can be found in places like the Nullarbor Plain and parts of the Queensland coast, evidence of a time when the sea stood a metre or two higher than it does now before gradually settling to its present position. For Aboriginal Australians, the stabilization of sea level was a profound event. For the first time in thousands of years, the coast was not moving. The shore you established camp on this generation would be the same shore your children would know. The reef your people fished would be the same reef the next generation would fish. The estuary where the best mud crabs could be found would be there next year and the year after, and for as far into the future as anyone could reasonably imagine. This stability allowed for the development of coastal cultures of extraordinary depth and complexity. The great middens of the Australian coast, those vast accumulations of shell and bone that in some places are meters deep and centuries old, began to build up in earnest once the coast stabilized. People could invest in places again. They could establish the long-term, intimate knowledge of specific coastal environments that produces the kind of ecological understanding that only comes from paying close attention to the same place for generations. The diversity of Aboriginal Australian coastal cultures that Europeans encountered when they arrived in the 18th century, the sophisticated fishing technology, the detailed seasonal calendars, the complex ceremony tied to coastal features and marine species, was the product of thousands of years of stable coastal occupation that had been made possible by the end of the flood. The flood created the modern coastline of Australia, and on that coastline, freed at last from the relentless retreat of the shore, the coastal peoples of Australia built some of the most intricate and detailed ecological knowledge systems that have ever existed anywhere on Earth. Everything that came before, the flooding, the retreating, the adapting, the carrying of stories across generations, all of it ended here, in the stillness, in the shore that finally stayed put, in the people who had survived everything the world had thrown at them and were still standing on the beach, watching the waves come in and go out with the tide, the way waves always have. Number 13. What genetics tells us, reading the flood in human DNA. Science has given us a new way to read the history of the flood, not through rocks or ocean sediments or the geography of underwater landforms, through the bodies of living people. Genetics, specifically the analysis of ancient and modern DNA, has, in the past 2 decades, transformed our understanding of human population history. And in Australia, it has revealed patterns that reflect, in remarkable ways, the history of the flood. One of the most striking findings involves population diversity. Aboriginal Australian communities today show a genetic pattern that, in simplified terms, reflects the existence of populations that were separated from one another for long periods of time. This separation can be explained, at least in part, by the geography of post-flood Australia. As the seas rose and swallowed the coastal plains, communities that had been connected by low-lying routes found themselves separated by water. Populations that had previously interacted regularly were cut off from one another, and over the thousands of years of separation, their genetic profiles diverged. The Bass Strait flooding is particularly clear in the genetic record. The Aboriginal Tasmanians who survived into the historical period and whose descendants carry particular genetic profiles show evidence of extended isolation consistent with separation from mainland Australia for around 12 to 15,000 years. This corresponds closely with the geological evidence for when the Bass Strait land bridge was submerged. Genetic analysis has also revealed something about the timing and scale of population movement during the flood period. When coastal populations were pushed inland by rising seas, they moved into territories already occupied by inland groups. The genetic signatures of this mixing can be read in the DNA of modern Aboriginal Australians, showing patterns of admixture that align with the timing and geography of the flood. Perhaps most extraordinarily, genetic analysis of ancient DNA from individuals whose remains have been found at archaeological sites gives us snapshots of population structure at specific moments in time. When we compare the genetics of individuals from before the flood period with those from after, we can sometimes see direct evidence of the population movements that the flood caused. This is not just archaeology or anthropology or linguistics. This is biology. The flood is written in the genes of living people, in the way populations are distributed around the continent, in the diversity patterns that reflect long separation, in the admixture signatures that reflect the encounters between displaced coastal communities and the inland peoples they moved among. The human body is, in a sense, an archive. It carries within it the history of everything that happened to its ancestors. The flood happened to the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australian people, and their descendants carry that history in the most intimate possible way, in every cell of every body, in the genetic code that is passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain reaching back across 12,000 years to the people who stood on the shore and watched the water come. Number 14. The flood in comparison, how Australia's experience fits the global story. Australia was not the only place that experienced the flood. The end of the last ice age raised sea levels globally, and coastlines all over the world were transformed by the rising waters. The Persian Gulf, which today separates the Arabian Peninsula from Iran, was dry land during the last glacial maximum. A large river valley ran through the Gulf, fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batan rivers, all of which drained into it and then out to sea through what is now the Strait of Hormuz. This valley has been proposed by some scholars as the location of the ancient Sumerian paradise called Dilmun, and the flooding of the Gulf, which occurred roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, may be related to flood stories in Mesopotamian and Hebrew tradition. The Black Sea, now a large inland sea connected to the Mediterranean through the Bosphorus, may have been a freshwater lake during the last glacial maximum, separated from the Mediterranean by a land barrier. Around 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, if the Black Sea hypothesis is correct, the Mediterranean broke through this barrier and flooded the lake basin in a significant event that may have driven human populations out of the region and contributed to flood legends across the ancient Near East. The North Sea, which today separates Britain from the European continent, was dry land during the last glacial maximum, a landscape that geologists call Doggerland extended across the area, supporting populations of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. As the seas rose, Doggerland was gradually inundated, becoming a coastal marsh, then a series of islands, and finally disappearing completely beneath the North Sea. The last remnants of Doggerland may have been affected by a large tsunami triggered by an underwater landslide off the Norwegian coast, called the Storegga Slide, around 8,000 years ago. All of these places have their flood stories, the Mesopotamian traditions of Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, the Hebrew Noah and his ark, the Greek Deucalion, the Hindu Manu, the Chinese Ganyu. Across the world's major cultural traditions, there is a story about a time when the water came and the world was transformed. Scholars have long debated whether these stories reflect a single global event or whether they represent the independent memory of locally specific flooding events, which would have been occurring all over the world as sea levels rose after the last ice age. The Australian evidence suggests strongly that local memory is closer to the truth. The flood traditions of Aboriginal Australia are geographically specific, referring to particular coastal regions and particular kinds of landscape. They are not a single global story, but many local stories, each reflecting the specific flooding experience of people in a particular place. And this makes sense. The rising seas affected every coastline, but they affected each one differently, at different rates, flooding different kinds of landscape, affecting populations with different cultural frameworks and different vulnerabilities. Each community experienced its own version of the flood, and each community made its own story about it. What Australia gives us, that most other places cannot, is the extraordinary preservation of those stories. The continuity of Aboriginal Australian culture across tens of thousands of years, the depth of the oral tradition, the sacredness with which stories of country are held and transmitted, means that what has been lost to time in most of the world's cultures has survived here. The flood stories of Australia are, in a very real sense, the oldest detailed accounts of what happened when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose. They are living testimony to one of the great transformations in Earth's recent history, and they are still being told. Number 15. The people who stayed near the sea, coastal adaptation at the edge of the rising world. Not all the peoples of ancient Sahul retreated from the coast as the sea rose. Some of them stayed. They moved, yes, but they moved parallel to the coast rather than away from it. They stayed in the coastal zone even as that zone shifted, following the retreating shore, maintaining their identity as coastal people even as the specific coast changed beneath them. This is, when you think about it, an extraordinary thing. For thousands of years, these coastal communities lived in a world where the definition of where the coast was changed within a human lifetime. The fishing spot your parents used might be underwater by the time you were old enough to fish. The bay where the dugongs gathered in summer might be an entirely different shape than it was a generation ago. Maintaining a viable coastal economy in these circumstances required something we might call dynamic ecological knowledge. Not just the knowledge of a specific place, which is what you develop when you live somewhere for generations without anything changing, but the ability to read coastal environments quickly, to understand the logic of how fish aggregate and how shellfish populate rocky reef, and how birds move through estuarine systems, in a way that allows you to apply that knowledge to new places as soon as you arrive in them. This is a different kind of intelligence than the sedentary ecological knowledge of people who live in stable places. It is the intelligence of adaptation, of pattern recognition, of being able to look at an unfamiliar beach and quickly understand what it offers and how to exploit its resources effectively. Aboriginal Australians who maintained coastal lifeways through the flood period must have developed this kind of dynamic coastal intelligence to an extraordinary degree. The evidence suggests they did. The ability to exploit an enormous range of coastal resources, from deep water fish to intertidal mollusks to mangrove-dwelling crustaceans to pelagic sea turtles, that characterizes coastal Aboriginal Australian cultures, represents a depth of ecological knowledge and technological development that took many thousands of years to accumulate. Much of that accumulation happened during the flood period itself. The necessity of adapting to new coasts and new conditions drove innovation. New technologies were developed or refined. New knowledge was generated and incorporated into the cultural system. New relationships with new species and new habitats were established. This is one of the enduring lessons of the Australian flood. Environmental stress, even dramatic environmental stress, does not necessarily produce cultural weakening. Sometimes it produces the opposite. Sometimes being forced to adapt, to move, to find new ways of doing things, generates a creative energy that static, settled conditions would never have produced. The richness of Aboriginal Australian coastal cultures is, in part, a legacy of the flood. Number 16. The Great Drying, how the interior changed as the coast flooded. While the coast was flooding, the interior of Australia was experiencing a different kind of transformation. The warming that caused the glaciers to melt and the seas to rise also changed the atmospheric circulation patterns that determine rainfall across Australia. As the climate warmed and the ice sheets retreated, the patterns of monsoon rainfall in the north and temperate rainfall in the south shifted. In many parts of the interior, the result was increasing aridity. The lakes of the interior that had held water during the last glacial maximum began to dry. The rivers that had flowed year-round began to flow seasonally, and then occasionally, and then not at all in some cases. Lake Mungo, that ancient lake in the Willandra system that had supported human life and the megafauna for tens of thousands of years, dried out completely. The date of its final drying is estimated at around 15,000 years ago, roughly coinciding with the beginning of the post-glacial warming. The people who had lived on its shores moved. Some of them may have moved toward the coast, joining the flow of refugees from the rising sea in a kind of grand convergence of people displaced from multiple directions by a single underlying cause: the end of the Ice Age. The drying of the interior created a different kind of challenge from the flooding of the coast. Rather than too much water in the wrong place, it was too little water in places that had previously had enough. The animals that had depended on the interior lakes and wetlands, the diprotodon, the giant kangaroos, the giant birds, found their habitats shrinking. The people who had hunted and fished those lakes found themselves in increasingly marginal country, having to work harder for the same resources or having to move to find better ones. The Great Drying of the interior is sometimes framed as a separate event from the coastal flooding, but they are aspects of the same process. The same warming that raised the seas also dried the interior. The same melting ice that caused meltwater pulses in the oceans also disrupted the atmospheric systems that delivered rain to Central Australia. The flood and the drying were two phases of a single planetary transformation, and the people of Sahul experienced both. Coastal people were displaced by flooding. Interior people were displaced by drying. The zones between the river valleys and the transitional regions between coast and interior became corridors of movement through which people flowed from both directions, seeking the kind of stable, productive country that was becoming harder to find. This convergence of displaced peoples into transitional zones had cultural consequences. It brought together people with different traditions, different languages, different technologies. It required negotiation and accommodation. It produced new blends and new innovations. It created, in compressed form, the kind of diversity and exchange that is the engine of cultural evolution. The modern diversity of Aboriginal Australian cultures and languages, that extraordinary mosaic of different peoples and traditions across the continent, is, at least in part, a legacy of this post-glacial reshuffling, this grand mixing of coastal refugees and interior refugees and the transitional people who were already living in the zones between, all finding new ways to exist on a continent that was rearranging itself around them. Number 17, Sacred Waters, How the Flood Shaped Spiritual Life. The flood did not just change the physical world of ancient Sahul, it changed the spiritual one too. Water, in Aboriginal Australian spiritual traditions, is rarely just water. It is a living presence, a spiritual force, a medium through which the actions of the dreaming continue to be expressed in the present world. The rainbow serpent, perhaps the most widespread spiritual figure in Aboriginal Australian tradition, is a being of water. It lives in permanent waterholes, in rivers, in the deep places where water always exists. It is a creature of enormous power, both creative and generative, and also capable of great force. It can bring rain, it can cause floods, it can make the waters rise and fall in ways that reshape the land. The rainbow serpent appears in traditions across the entire Australian continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from the western desert to the eastern coast. Its specific characteristics vary between cultures and regions, but the core identity is consistent, a great serpentine water spirit that embodies the power and significance of water. Scholars have noted that the rainbow serpent tradition appears to have intensified or developed significantly in the Holocene period, the period following the end of the Ice Age. This timing has not escaped attention. It is precisely the period during which water, in the form of the rising seas, became the dominant force reshaping the continent. Could the rainbow serpent tradition, at least in part, represent a spiritual response to the experience of the flood? A way of understanding and relating to the powerful capacity of water to swallow land and transform landscapes? This is thoughtful speculation. We cannot know with certainty the relationship between the development of spiritual traditions and the specific historical events that may have influenced them, but the coincidence is suggestive. In a world being remade by water, a spiritual framework that places water at the center of creation and transformation would be both emotionally resonant and culturally meaningful. It would explain the flood in terms that made it comprehensible. It would situate the powerful force of the rising sea within a larger spiritual order that the community could relate to and potentially engage with through ceremony and story. Beyond the rainbow serpent, the flood may have shaped spiritual life in more direct ways. Sacred sites in Aboriginal Australian tradition are often places with specific physical characteristics, places where the dreaming breaks through into the everyday world. Many of these sites are associated with water holes and rivers in the sea. Some scholars have suggested that certain sacred water holes, those places of deepest spiritual significance where water always exists, even in drought, may represent cultural memories of places that once had water permanently, places now inland and often dry, that were once coastal or riverine environments before the flood changed the landscape. If this is right, then the spiritual geography of Australia is, in part, a map of a world the waters remade. The sacred places mark where the water used to be. The ceremonies performed there maintain the connection to a landscape that existed before the flood, a landscape that the dreaming holds even though the physical world has moved on. This is a profound idea, that the spiritual life of a people can preserve, across 12,000 years, the geography of a world that the physical world has left behind. Number 18. The technology of survival. What tools reveal about flood era adaptation? The archaeological record of Australia during the flood period contains evidence of significant technological change that appears to be related, at least in part, to the challenges of adapting to a world in transition. One of the most discussed changes is the appearance of a new suite of small stone tools, called the Australian small tool tradition, which appears in the archaeological record around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago and becomes widespread across the continent. These small, precisely made tools, including geometric microliths and small-backed blades, represent a significant departure from the larger, more generalized stone tools that dominate the earlier Australian record. What drove this change? Several explanations have been proposed. The tools may reflect new hafting technologies, the practice of inserting small stone blades into handles or shafts to create composite tools like spears with replaceable tips. They may reflect adaptations to the particular challenges of hunting and processing resources in the more diverse but often smaller and more mobile prey populations of the post-glacial world. They may reflect the exchange of ideas and technologies across the continent as populations were mixed and rearranged by the flood period. What is notable is that the timing of this technological change, while somewhat later than the period of maximum flooding, falls within the long tail of post-glacial adjustment. Australia was still settling into its new, more contracted form. Coastlines were still adjusting to their approximate modern positions. Populations that had been displaced by flooding were still working out their new territories and relationships. In this context, new tool technologies represent exactly the kind of adaptation you would expect from populations under sustained environmental pressure. Fishing technology is another area where the flood period appears to have driven innovation. As coastal people were pushed to new shores and had to learn new marine environments, they would have needed to develop or adapt tools for the specific resources available in their new locations. Fish traps in certain river systems, stone weirs and eel traps in others, new designs for different fishing environments, all of these innovations appear in the archaeological record of the post-flood period and suggest populations actively developing solutions to new environmental challenges. The technology of the flood period is not spectacular in the way that dramatic weapon caches or elaborate artifacts can be. It is, rather, the quiet technology of daily adaptation, of people solving practical problems in practical ways. But it represents, in its cumulative effect, a remarkable achievement. The adaptation of an entire continental population to a dramatically altered world, achieved through incremental innovation over thousands of years, without writing, without metal, without the institutional structures we tend to associate with large-scale adaptation. It was done with stone and bone and plant fiber and knowledge, with the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of observation and experiment, with the ingenuity of people who had no choice but to be ingenious. Number 19. Children of the flood, the modern inheritors of an ancient story. The flood ended, the seas stabilized, the continent settled into roughly its modern form, and the people who had survived it all, who had carried the stories and the songs and the sacred knowledge through thousands of years of change, they kept going. They kept going, and their descendants are alive today. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia are the direct inheritors of the greatest story of survival and adaptation in human history. Their cultures carry, encoded in story and song and ceremony, and the deep knowledge of country, the memory of a world that no one else remembers. The flood that swallowed Sahul, that raised the seas and drowned the ancient coastal plains, that separated Tasmania from the mainland and created the Arafura Sea, that drove the first great transformation of the Australian landscape in human memory. That story lives in their traditions. It has lived there for 12,000 years. When you understand this, many things about Aboriginal Australian culture look different. The deep attachment to specific pieces of country becomes not just sentiment, but the accumulated intimacy of thousands of years of careful observation and relationship. The sacredness of water sites becomes not just custom, but the encoded memory of a people whose world was once defined by where the water was and what happened when it moved. The oral traditions that seem to outsiders like mere mythology become what they actually are. Some of the oldest and most accurate geological records in human possession. The flood created the modern Australia in a physical sense. It drew the coastlines and separated the islands and formed the shallow seas and the deep bays. but it also created the modern Australia in a cultural sense. It shaped the peoples who live there, their traditions, their knowledge, their spiritual frameworks, their technologies. It is woven into everything, visible to those who know how to look. The knowledge is not lost. It was never lost. It was carried carefully, lovingly, across more generations than any other tradition on Earth has managed to carry anything. It was considered worth preserving, worth teaching, worth the enormous cultural effort of maintaining oral tradition, with the fidelity and precision that the geological record confirms it has. That is a testament to something, to the seriousness with which the people of ancient Sahul understood their own history, to the wisdom of a culture that knew, somehow, that the things that had happened to it were worth remembering and passing on, to the extraordinary resilience of human culture when it is treated as the sacred, necessary thing it is. As you settle deeper into sleep now, take that with you. The knowledge that somewhere in the world there are people who remember the flood, who carry the story of the rising seas not in books but in voice and breath and ceremony, who know the names of places that no one else knows existed, who sing still of a country that the rest of the world has forgotten. They are still here, and the story is still alive. Number 20. The science of reading old shores, how geologists reconstruct the lost world. Let us spend some time with the scientists who are trying to put the picture back together, who are looking at the data of the ocean floor and the chemistry of ancient corals and the sediments of old beaches, and trying to reconstruct as precisely as possible what happened to Australia's coastline over the past 12,000 years. This work is painstaking and requires expertise across multiple disciplines. Geologists who study sea level change use a variety of methods to reconstruct ancient shorelines. One of the most powerful is the analysis of coral reefs. Certain species of coral grow only within a very narrow range of water depths. By finding ancient coral of these species, dating it precisely using radioactive decay methods, and determining the water depth at which it grew, researchers can establish a data point. At this particular time, the sea surface was at this particular depth above where we found this coral. String together enough of these data points and you can draw a curve of sea level change over time. This curve, for Australia, has been refined enormously over the past few decades. We now know, with considerable precision, when sea levels were at particular heights around Australia during the post-glacial period. We can identify the meltwater pulses as sudden vertical jumps in the curve. We can see the periods of relative stability as flat sections. We can trace the overall shape of the flooding. Another method involves the analysis of ancient beaches and shoreline features. When the sea stood at a particular level for long enough to establish a beach, it leaves behind evidence. Beach ridges of sand and shell, notches cut into rock platforms by wave action, deposits of beach sediment in positions now well above or below modern sea level. By mapping these features and dating the materials within them, researchers can establish where the shoreline was at different times. In some parts of Australia, particularly along the northern coast and on the Great Barrier Reef, the record is extraordinarily detailed. Researchers have been able to reconstruct the step-by-step flooding of particular bays and inlets, tracing the advance of the sea across specific pieces of geography with a precision that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. This scientific work is in active dialogue with the oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians. Researchers like Nunn and Reid have found that the geological data and the cultural traditions are often mutually illuminating. The stories tell the scientists where to look for evidence of specific flooding events. The geological data helps interpret the geographical references in the stories. Together, they create a richer picture than either could produce alone. This collaboration between Western science and Indigenous knowledge is not always easy. It requires genuine respect for the traditions on both sides, a willingness by scientists to take seriously knowledge transmitted in forms unfamiliar to them, and a willingness by tradition holders to engage with the strange tools and questions of a scientific approach that can seem cold and reductive compared to the living richness of oral tradition. When it works, when the collaboration is genuine and the respect is mutual, the results are extraordinary. The picture of ancient Australia that emerges from the combination of geology and oral tradition is more complete, more human, and more profound than either discipline could produce alone. It is a picture of a real world, inhabited by real people, experiencing real events, and finding real ways to understand and survive what was happening to them. That is the best kind of science, the kind that brings us closer to the reality of other people's lives. Number 21. Rivers Lost and Found, the underwater drainage of ancient Sahul. One of the most evocative aspects of the drowned Sahul landscape is its river systems. Rivers are the veins of a continent, the pathways that water takes from the high places to the sea, the corridors that living things follow, the features that define the character of a landscape more than almost anything else. Ancient Sahul had rivers, many of them. The rivers that now empty into the northern Australian coast, the great rivers of the Kimberley, the rivers of Arnhem Land, the rivers of the Gulf of Carpentaria. These rivers did not stop at the modern coastline in the ancient world. They continued across the dry Sahul shelf in river valleys now drowned, flowing out to a sea that was far, far further away than it is today. Using sophisticated bathymetric surveys, researchers have been able to map these ancient river channels on the seafloor. The underwater topography of the Sahul shelf preserves, in faint but real form, the drainage patterns of a lost landscape. You can see where the ancient rivers ran, where they converged, where they fanned out into deltas at the ancient shore. The largest of these ancient drainage systems was enormous. The Kimberley and Arnhem Land rivers, combined with rivers from what is now New Guinea, may have fed a great ancient waterway that drained much of the Sahul plain northwestward toward the ancient Timor Sea shore. This system would have been one of the major river systems of ancient Sahul, comparable in size to some of the great rivers of the modern world. It is now entirely underwater, but its valley is there, preserved on the ocean floor, a ghost of drainage carved into seafloor sediments. If you could somehow drain the Timor Sea and look at the Sahul shelf, you would see it, that ancient valley system, the branches of the old rivers converging into a main channel, the channel widening as it nears what was once the sea. And along those ancient riverbanks there were people. The rivers were where you went for water in a dry season. They were where you went for fish. They were where the freshwater mussels lived, and the turtles, and the birds that fed on aquatic insects and small fish. Rivers were the highways of ancient Sahul, the natural routes through the landscape, the places where the network of human activity was densest. All of that is now underwater, the campsites on the riverbanks, the fishing spots, the places where people crossed in the dry season when the water was low, the sacred pools where certain ceremonies were performed, under the Timor Sea, under the Arafura Sea, under the shallow northern reaches of the Indian Ocean, lost but not entirely. The rivers remember their own paths in the shape of the seafloor. The people who lived on them remember their existence in the shape of their traditions. And the scientists who look carefully at underwater maps can see, in the branching patterns of ancient sediment, the ghost of a drainage system that once carried the reins of a great continent to a sea that was, in its day, as real and as present as the sea is now. Number 22. What the ancient flood teaches the watching world. We are living through another period of change in the relationship between land and sea. This is not the place for a detailed discussion of modern climate pressures, but it would be wrong to spend an evening thinking about the flood that changed Australia 12,000 years ago without acknowledging that sea levels are rising again. Not at the same rate, not driven by the same mechanisms, and with a very different human context, but rising nonetheless. The ancient Australians whose stories we have been telling tonight could not stop the flood. They did not understand its causes. They could not model its future trajectory. They could not predict, even roughly, how far the water would ultimately rise. They could only adapt, move, carry their knowledge to new places, try to maintain the essential things, the relationships, the stories, the understanding of country, even as the country itself changed. We are in a different position. We do understand the causes of the current changes. We can model trajectories with considerable accuracy. We know, in principle, what would need to happen to slow or stop them. We have, in theory, more agency than the people of ancient Sahul ever had. Whether we will use that agency wisely is not a question for a sleep story. But the ancient flood does offer something relevant to the modern moment, a demonstration of what humans are capable of when the world changes around them. A reminder that the loss of coastlines, while deeply significant, is something that communities can adapt to and survive. That cultures can maintain their essential character and knowledge through enormous environmental disruption. That adaptation, even to changes of a scale that seems enormous, is something that human beings can manage. The Aboriginal Australians who carried the memory of the flood across 12,000 years were not passive victims. They were active agents of their own survival. They made choices, they developed technologies. They created cultural institutions that preserved what mattered most. They adapted to a new world without losing the essential connection to the old one. That is, perhaps, the deepest lesson of the ancient flood. Not that floods are inevitable, not that loss is bearable, though both of these are true. The deepest lesson is that what we choose to preserve, what we decide is worth the enormous effort of carrying across generations, shapes who we become on the other side of change. The people of ancient Sahul chose to preserve the stories, the songs, the knowledge of country, the memory of the flood itself, and in making that choice, they preserved something that turned out to be extraordinarily valuable, not just to themselves, but to the entire world. A record of an event that everyone else forgot. A testimony to the reality of a world that everyone else lost. What will we choose to preserve? These are questions that the ancient flood and its modern resonances press upon us with considerable thoughtfulness. But those questions are for daylight. For now, let them drift gently through your mind as you settle towards sleep, not urgently, not anxiously, just as questions floating quietly in the space between waking and dreaming. The flood came, the people survived, the stories were carried, and here we are, 12,000 years later, still telling them. Number 23, the naming of waters, how Aboriginal languages map the flood. Language is a map. Every language is, in a sense, a detailed map of the reality that the people who speak it inhabit and pay attention to. Aboriginal Australian languages, of which there were once more than 250 distinct examples, and of which around 120 survive to varying degrees today, are among the most complex and detailed maps of landscape and ecological reality ever created. They encode observations about the natural world, about seasonal patterns, about the behavior of animals and plants that represent tens of thousands of years of careful attention. The words for water in many Aboriginal Australian languages are extraordinarily specific. Not just water, but water in its many particular forms and contexts. The word for water in a rocky gorge is different from the word for water in a flat clay pan. The word for water that smells of vegetation is different from the word for water that is fresh and clear from a spring. Water that is significant and sacred, water that is seasonal, water that persists through drought, all have their specific names, their particular identities in the linguistic landscape. This linguistic richness around water reflects, among other things, the importance of water knowledge for survival in a continent that is, for much of the year and much of its area, dry. Knowing where the water is, what kind of water it is, how reliable it is knowledge that can mean the difference between finding a campsite and not. The language encodes that knowledge in a form that can be precisely communicated and reliably transmitted. But some of the water words in Aboriginal Australian languages may encode something older even than this. There are words in certain coastal languages for types of water phenomena, for the behavior of the sea in certain circumstances, for specific kinds of flooding events that seem to describe conditions more extreme than anything currently observable in those regions. These words have puzzled linguists who encounter them, because the phenomena they describe seem to exceed what the modern landscape would require words for. One interpretation is that these words encode memories of the flood period, words developed to describe the specific phenomena of transgressing seas, of coastal plains being flooded, of the particular behavior of salt water invading freshwater systems, retained in the language even after those phenomena were no longer regularly observed because the words carried cultural weight, because they were embedded in stories and songs that were considered too important to lose. If this interpretation is correct, then the language of the flood survives in the language of the people who live through it. Not just in the stories, not just in the ceremonies, but in the vocabulary, in the specific words available for describing what water does when it moves inland and swallows the country. This is the kind of linguistic archaeology that is, in some ways, the most intimate form of contact with the ancient past. Not a stone tool, not a coral sample, but a word, spoken today, by a living person, that was first created by someone watching the sea come in across a flat plain, that would be forever after ocean floor. A word that has been spoken continuously for 12,000 years. Number 24, islands that were mountains, the scattered remnants of drowned country. Look at a map of the islands off the northern coast of Australia. The Tiwi Islands, the Wessel Islands, the Groote Eylandt, the islands of the Gulf of Carpentaria, and further north toward New Guinea, the Aru Islands. Now, imagine the sea drained away by 120 meters. What you see when you do that is remarkable. Those islands are not islands at all. They are the high points of a landscape that was, in the time of the last glacial maximum, continuous with the mainland. The Tiwi Islands were hills, ridges, elevated sections of the Sahul plain, above the level of the surrounding flat country. As the sea rose and the plain flooded, those high points remained above water, becoming the islands they are today. The Tiwi Islands have been inhabited continuously since before the flooding. There were people on those hills before they became islands. And when the surrounding plain was swallowed by the sea, the people on the hills were stranded. but they were stranded on islands with substantial resources, rich forest, good beaches, abundant marine life. The Tiwi people developed over the thousands of years of their island existence, a culture of extraordinary richness, distinct from the mainland cultures in many ways, but clearly sharing the deep common heritage of ancient Sahul. The same pattern played out across the northern archipelago. What is now a chain of islands was once a chain of high points on a continuous landscape. As the sea rose, each high point became its own island, each island population its own community, developing its own particular cultural innovations while maintaining the deep shared foundations of an older continental culture. The islands, in this sense, are markers of the flood. They tell you where the high ground was on the plain that the sea swallowed. They preserved, above the waterline, communities that would otherwise have had to retreat southward with the receding coast. They created, inadvertently, the conditions for cultural diversification, as island communities developed in partial isolation from one another and from the mainland, and they preserved, in some cases, extraordinarily ancient cultural traditions. The island communities of northern Australia, cut off from the mainland by the rising seas, maintained traditions and practices that in some cases diverged significantly from mainland developments. Some scholars have argued that these island cultures represent, in certain ways, more conservative versions of the ancient Sahul culture, less subject to the continental scale cultural exchanges and innovations of the mainland, more likely to retain older forms. Whether or not this is precisely right, the islands of northern Australia are, in a deep sense, children of the flood. They were made by the rising sea. Their separation, their distinctiveness, their particular cultural identities, all of this is a direct consequence of the flooding that created the modern northern Australian coastline. The islands remember the flood in their very existence. They are the parts of the old world that the sea did not quite manage to swallow. Number 25, the archaeology of memory, keeping the oldest stories alive. There is a practice in Aboriginal Australian cultures that is sometimes described by outsiders as performing or enacting the dreaming, but these words miss something essential. In many Aboriginal traditions, the ceremonies and stories associated with specific places and events are not representations of the past, they are continuations of it. The dreaming, that complex concept sometimes translated as the period of creation, but better understood as the underlying structure of reality that creates and sustains everything, is not over. It is still happening. The stories of the dreaming are not history in the Western sense, events that occurred in the past and are now done. They are expressions of a living reality that persists into the present. When a ceremony is performed, when a song is sung, when a story is told, the events described are not merely remembered. They are, in some sense, renewed. The connection between the present world and the deeper reality of the dreaming is reactivated. The country is re-engaged, the ancestors who are embedded in the country are honored and invoked. This framework has profound implications for understanding how the memory of the flood has been preserved. It was not preserved as a historical record, the way a library preserves a document. It was preserved as a living practice, renewed each time the ceremony was performed or the story was told. The flood did not just happen once, 12,000 years ago. In a certain sense, it happens every time the story is told, every time the ceremony is performed, every time the connection between the present people and the flooded country is renewed. This is a very different relationship with time and memory than the one most of us are familiar with. It does not separate the past from the present in the way that historical thinking does. It keeps the past continuously alive in the present, makes it a dimension of current experience rather than a record of finished events. And it works. Whatever its philosophical underpinnings, this approach to cultural memory has demonstrated a preservative power that Western historical tradition, with all its libraries and archives and written records, has rarely matched. The geological accuracy of flood traditions that are potentially 12,000 years old is testimony to the effectiveness of this approach. When the story is a living practice rather than a historical record, when it is something you do rather than something you know, it is harder to lose. You can forget a book, you can lose an archive. But a living practice embedded in the deep structure of a community's ceremonial life is extraordinarily difficult to lose as long as the community itself survives. The Aboriginal Australians preserved the memory of the flood because they treated it as something that needed to be done, not just known. And in doing it, generation after generation, they kept it alive. That is the archaeology of memory, not artifacts in the ground, living practice in the present. Number 26, the return of the water, tidal patterns and seasonal floods as living memory. Even after the Great Flood ended, water continued to shape the lives of the people of Australia in ways that echoed, on a smaller scale, the transformations of the post-glacial period. The monsoon of northern Australia brings every year a flood. Not the coast-swallowing flood of the Holocene, but a real and powerful flooding of the low-lying coastal plains and river systems. During the wet season, which typically runs from November through April in the far north, the rivers overflow their banks, the coastal floodplains become shallow seas of fresh water, and the landscape transforms from dry grassland to vast aquatic habitat. This annual flooding is not merely a weather phenomenon. It is a cultural event of the highest significance for the peoples of northern Australia. The wet season brings different foods, different movement patterns, different ceremony. The floodplains that seem merely challenging during the dry season become, in the wet, productive habitats teeming with fish and water birds, and the freshwater plants that are a dietary staple. The Aboriginal peoples of northern Australia have developed, over tens of thousands of years, an extraordinarily detailed understanding of this annual flood cycle. They know, from subtle environmental cues, when the wet is coming. They know which areas will flood first and which will remain dry longest. They know where the fish aggregate as the waters rise and where they retreat to as the waters fall. They know how to move across flooded country in ways that are safe and efficient. They know when and where to set fish traps and when and where to find water birds. This knowledge is, in a sense, an echo of the knowledge that sustained their ancestors through the Great Flood of the Holocene. The annual flood is a reminder, repeated every year, of what water can do when it rises and spreads across flat country. And the skills developed for managing the annual flood, for living productively in a flooding landscape, are the same skills that their ancestors used to adapt to the rising of the post-glacial seas. The annual flood keeps the memory alive, not as a historical event to be recalled, but as a living reality to be navigated. The people of northern Australia do not think of flooding as something that happened long ago to their ancestors. They think of flooding as part of the normal rhythm of the world, something that happens every year, something to be prepared for and worked with rather than fought against. This is perhaps one of the reasons the flood memory has survived so well in the north. The annual wet season flood keeps the cultural systems for dealing with flooding active, keeps the knowledge current, prevents it from becoming merely historical. The big flood of the Holocene and the small flood of each wet season are, in the cultural framework of northern Australia, related events. Different in scale, but the same in kind. Water rising, covering land, demanding adaptation. The monsoon country of northern Australia is, in this sense, a living museum of the flood experience. Every wet season is a small echo of the ancient transformation. Every year the people navigate the rising waters, using knowledge and skills that are, at root, the same knowledge and skills that brought their ancestors through the greatest flooding event in the human memory of this continent. Number 27, the last slide of Sahul, imagining the final shore. Let us spend some time with an image. Let us imagine, as vividly as we can, the last generation of people who lived on the Sahul plain before the final flooding. It is around 8,000 years ago. The great meltwater pulses are done, the sea is approaching its modern level, but it is not there yet. There are still some areas of the old Sahul shelf above water, becoming increasingly marginal, increasingly surrounded by the encroaching sea on multiple sides. On one of these remaining low plains, somewhere in what is now the shallow waters of the Arafura Sea, a group of people are camped. There are perhaps 30 or 40 of them, an extended family group with all the relationships and shared history that implies. They have been living on this plain for as long as anyone among them can remember. Their grandparents' grandparents were here. Their traditions, their knowledge, their songs are tied to this specific place. The water has been rising for as long as anyone can remember. The elders speak of landmarks that no longer exist. The Tidal creek that used to run through the middle of the camp is now a saltwater channel, too wide and too deep to cross except at low tide. The freshwater spring that the camp was built around still flows, but it tastes different now, saltier. The sea is finding its way into the groundwater. They know they will have to move. They have known this for some time. The question is not whether, but when and where to. Some of them have already moved, younger families who married into inland groups and went to live in new country. They send word back occasionally, through the elaborate networks of messenger and ceremony that connect even distant communities. The inland country is good, they say. Different, harder in some ways, but livable. The older ones resist. This is their country. Their ancestors are buried here. Their ceremonies belong here. The songs that map the spiritual geography of this landscape, the songs that connect them to the dreaming that underlies this specific piece of the world, those songs were made for this place. You cannot simply take them somewhere else and expect them to work the same way. But the water is coming. The salt is in the spring. The mangroves are advancing from the south, following the salt water into what was once freshwater marsh. The birds that used to nest in the mangroves are moving inland, following the edge of the new habitat. Everything's moving. Everything's adjusting to the new world that the sea is making. And so eventually they will move too. They will pack what can be packed. They will perform the ceremonies of leaving, the songs that acknowledge the country and ask permission of the ancestors to go. They will carry with them, in memory and voice, the songs and the stories of a place that will be underwater before their grandchildren are grown. They will find new country. They will learn its rhythms and its resources. They will make new relationships with the people already there. They will tell their children about the country they came from, describe it in detail, make it live in the children's minds even though the children will never see it. And they will make the children promise to tell their children, and on and on and on and on, down through 12,000 years, until now, until tonight, until this story told in the darkness to people who are, in ways most of us have never considered, the inheritors of everything that happened on that plain before the sea took it. We are all, in one way or another, connected to that ancient world. We live in the world it made. We breathe air above waters that cover places where people once breathed and lived and loved. We are connected to that ancient world by the thread of story, the thread of voice and memory, and the sacred obligation to pass on what matters. The people on that last shore carried their stories with them when they left, and the stories are still here. Number 28, after the flood, what Australia became. The continent that emerged from the flood was not worse than what came before it. It was different, dramatically, irreversibly different. But different is not the same as worse. The Australia that stabilized into its modern form around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago was a place of extraordinary diversity and richness. The coastline, while much reduced from the expansive shores of ancient Sahul, was nonetheless remarkably varied. The tropical north with its monsoon coasts and tidal estuaries, the rocky shores of the northwest Kimberley, the arid coast of the Nullarbor, the temperate southwestern corner with its Mediterranean climate vegetation running to the sea, the dramatic southern coast with its limestone cliffs and cold upwellings, the long sandy beaches of the east, the intricate bays and waterways of the southeast, the island-dotted north from Arnhem Land around the Gulf of Carpentaria. Each of these coastlines supported its own suite of human cultures, its own ecological knowledge systems, its own ceremonial traditions and technological innovations. The diversity was, and is, extraordinary. The interior of the continent, while drier than it had been during the Ice Age, was not simply a desert. It was a complex mosaic of habitats, from the red sand deserts to the spinifex grasslands, to the mulga woodlands to the mountain ranges with their surprising microhabitats to the rivers, still flowing in seasons, even if not year-round, that ran from the interior toward the coasts. The people who lived in this interior were, arguably, among the most skilled desert inhabitants who have ever existed on Earth. Their knowledge of where water could be found, how to read the landscape for signs of hidden resources, how to move efficiently through country that would challenge an unprepared person within days. This knowledge was refined over thousands of years to a degree of precision and completeness that remains astonishing. And in the north, in the coastal wetlands and the monsoon forests, the people who had found their way to these new shores after the flooding of the Sahul Plain developed cultures of extraordinary richness. The rock art galleries of Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, which contain paintings dating back tens of thousands of years, and which continue to be added to today, are among the greatest repositories of art and cultural memory in the world. The Australia that the flood made is the Australia that European colonizers encountered in the late 18th century. It was a continent with perhaps 500,000 to 1 million people, organized into hundreds of distinct cultural groups, speaking more than 250 languages, with a combined knowledge of the continent's ecology, climate, and resources that exceeded anything any other culture has developed in any comparable region. That culture is the product in part of the flood, of the long process of adaptation and resilience that the rising seas demanded, of the creativity and flexibility that displacement and encounter generate, of the wisdom that comes from living through something enormous and carrying the memory of it forward as a sacred obligation. The flood made modern Australia. And the people who made it through the flood made the culture that defines the deep human story of this continent. Number 29, the long night settling into the silence after the flood. We have come a long way tonight, from the wide flat plains of ancient Sahul to the drowned lands of the northern shelf, from the Ice Age cold to the warming seas of the Holocene, from the first great surge of Meltwater Pulse 1A to the final stabilization of the sea at its modern level, from the initial difficulty of losing country to the resilience of people who survived. And we have heard throughout the faint voice of the oral traditions, those extraordinary preserved memories of people who watched the flood and told their children, who told their children, who told their children, down through the long chain of generations, until the story reached us here, tonight, in the darkness that comes when the day is done. The flood changed Australia profoundly. It remade the continent, it created the coastlines we know, it formed the islands, it drowned the ancient plains, it separated Tasmania from the mainland, it pushed people inland and together and apart in ways that shaped the extraordinary cultural diversity of the continent. It drove the extinction of the last megafauna. It made possible the formation of the Great Barrier Reef. It is woven into the spiritual frameworks, the oral traditions, the languages, the technologies, and the genetic heritage of the Australian people. And it was not remembered by most of the world. The written record, which exists only for the past 5,000 or 6,000 years, was created well after the flood was over. The civilizations that kept written records, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians and the Indus Valley peoples, all came into existence after the worst of the flooding was done. They inherited a world already shaped by the flood, not one still experiencing it. Only in the oral traditions of the world's oldest continuous cultures, primarily but not exclusively the Aboriginal Australians, do we have direct transmitted memory of what the flood was like, of what it felt like to watch the shore retreat, of what it meant to leave behind the country of your ancestors, of how the world looked before the sea took it. These traditions are among the most precious things in human cultural heritage, not because they are curiosities, not because they are archaeological data points, but because they are what they present themselves as being, the memory of an experience, the preserved testimony of people who lived through something enormous and chose to carry the knowledge of it forward, to give it to their descendants as a gift and a record of what the world is capable of doing and what people are capable of surviving. As you close your eyes tonight, if you have not already, let the ancient world drift through your mind. The Sahul plain in the evening light, the rivers finding their way across the flat country to a sea much further away than it is now. The fires on the riverbanks, the sound of voices speaking languages so old we have no way to fully hear them, no recordings, no writing, nothing but the faintest echoes in the languages that descended from them over 60,000 years. And the slow, inexorable rise of the water, the shore moving inland, generation by generation, the country shrinking, the people moving, the stories being passed, carefully, lovingly, across every night like this one. Every campfire that ever burned on the edge of the retreating coast. They kept the story, they carried it, and it is here still, in the traditions of the people who survived. Breathe slowly. Let the story settle around you like water around the last of the high ground. Everything changes, and something always remains. Number 30. Sleeping at the edge of the ancient sea. We have come to the end of our journey through the great flood that changed Australia 12,000 years ago. We began on the wide Sahul plain, in the cold, dry air of the last ice age, among the megafauna, and the people who had been living there for 60,000 years. We watched the ice melt and the seas rise. We felt the first great surge of Meltwater Pulse 1A, that dramatic acceleration of flooding that began around 14,000 years ago and swallowed vast areas of the ancient coast in just a few centuries. We followed the flooding of the northern plains, the drowning of the land bridge to New Guinea, the birth of the Arafura Sea. We watched Tasmania become an island as the Bass Strait flooded. We listened to the voices of the oral traditions, those extraordinary preserved memories of people who watched the flood and chose to remember it. We spent time with the science, with the geologists and geneticists and underwater archaeologists who are reconstructing the lost world of Sahul from the clues it left behind. We thought about the animals that were lost, the technologies that were developed, the spiritual frameworks that emerged to make sense of a world being swallowed by water. We considered the languages that still carry, in specific water words and landscape descriptions, the memory of a coast that no longer exists. And we sat for a while on that last shore, with the people who were among the final inhabitants of the old world, who packed their knowledge and their stories and moved inland before the sea took the last of the plain. This is a story of loss. The loss of an entire continent's worth of coastline, of the animals and habitats that lived there, of the specific cultural connections to specific places that the flood transformed. That loss was real and it was enormous, but it is also a story of survival, of people who found, within themselves and within their cultures, the resources to adapt to changes of a scale that would test any community to its limits. Of a tradition of oral memory so powerful and so faithful that it preserved the details of the flood across 12,000 years, of creativity and resilience and the extraordinary human capacity to keep going, to find new country, to make new songs, to carry the old world forward in memory while building a new world in practice. As you drift now toward the deep country of sleep, let those two things rest together in your mind, the loss and the survival, the world that was swallowed and the world that was built from what remained. The sea came, the people moved, the stories were carried, and the world that emerged from all of it, the world of the Great Barrier Reef and the Arafura Sea, and the islands that were once hilltops, and the rock art galleries that stretch back further than any written record. That world is here. It exists. It is real. And somewhere in it, the story of the flood is still being told, not as history, as living memory, as sacred testimony to the reality of a world that the sea took and the people kept. Sleep well. Let the ancient waters carry you gently. The shore will be here in the morning, and the story will still be alive. If you found comfort in tonight's journey through ancient Australia, please subscribe for new sleep histories every week. Each episode is made to carry you gently through the long, quiet hours of the night, with stories from the deep past of our world, told slowly and carefully, the way good stories always were, before there was anything but voice and firelight and the darkness and the stars. Thank you for listening, and good night. Number 31. The silence of the deep, what sound, tells us about an ancient continent. There is a particular quality of silence that exists in the deep ocean, not the absence of sound, because the ocean is never truly silent, but a quality of muffled distance, of pressure and darkness, and the slow passage of time that is unlike any silence found on land. Beneath the Arafura Sea, in the darkness under 50 or 60 meters of water, the Sahul plain exists in something like that silence now. The fires that burn there are long cold. The voices that spoke there are long still. The birds that called in the evenings over the grass have been replaced by the slow passage of fish and the gentle settling of sediment from above. But sound travels in ways we do not always expect, and the seafloor is not entirely silent. Researchers working with underwater acoustic equipment in the shallow seas north of Australia have recorded the sounds of the seafloor, the grinding of sediment in currents, the distant rumble of geological processes, the occasional sharp crack of rock. And mixed with these sounds, sometimes, are things harder to explain. Geological features that produce particular resonances, underwater cliffs and canyon edges that reflect and channel sound in unexpected ways. The ancient landscape of the Sahul Shelf is not just a visual geography preserved in the topography of the seafloor. It is an acoustic geography too. The valleys and ridges that shape the flow of sound across the ancient plain still shape the flow of sound through the water that now covers it. The shape of the land is still there, in the silence beneath the sea, resonating in ways that the water cannot entirely erase. This is a meditation more than a scientific claim. The precise acoustics of the Sahul Shelf are not a well-studied field, but the idea is real, that the shape of the ancient landscape persists in multiple dimensions beneath the sea, not just visually in the topography of the seafloor, not just chemically in the sediments and the preserved pollen, and the organic material that slowly decomposes in the deep, but physically in the way that the geometry of the underwater terrain shapes the movement of water and sound. The ancient world is still there, in more ways than one. And the night is a good time to sit with that knowledge, quietly, and let it settle into you the way the sea settled over the Sahul plain, slowly and completely, and without hurry. Number 32. The dreaming of water, deep time, and the river that was. The concept of the dreaming in Aboriginal Australian thought is one of the most complex and misunderstood ideas in all of cross-cultural philosophy. It has been flattened by outsiders into something simpler than it is, called mythology, called religion, called the time of creation, as if it is something that happened and then stopped. But the dreaming is not in the past. It is the foundational layer of reality that underlies and generates the present. It is happening now, as it always was, as it always will be. The rivers that flow today flow because they follow the tracks laid down in the dreaming. The animals exist in their current forms because they were shaped in the dreaming. The rocks and hills and water holes and the relationships between them are expressions of dreaming events that are not over but ongoing, perpetually present in the structure of the world. When an ancient river is drowned by the sea, what happens to its dreaming track? This is not a question with a simple answer, but the traditions of many Aboriginal Australian groups who have lost country to the sea suggest that the dreaming does not simply disappear when the land does. The tracks persist. The ancestral beings who made the tracks are still there in the water now instead of on the land, still moving through the country they made, even though that country is now underwater. This is why some traditions describe sacred underwater sites, places beneath the sea where the dreaming is still powerfully present, places that a knowledgeable person can locate from a boat by reading the patterns of the water above, the color, the movement, the presence of certain species of marine life that gather where the underwater dreaming is strong. The sea did not erase the dreaming of the Sahul plain, it covered it, and the dreaming, being the foundational layer of reality rather than merely a feature of the surface, persists beneath the water as real and as potent as it was when people walked above it on dry land. This is, whatever one makes of it philosophically, a remarkable cultural response to the flood. The flood did not destroy the sacred geography of the people, it relocated it, and the people maintained their connection to that relocated sacred geography through the traditions of underwater dreaming sites and the knowledge of where, beneath the sea, the ancient tracks still run. There is something deeply comforting about this, in the deep quiet of a late night. The idea that loss is not total, that the things that matter, the sacred structures of the world, persist through change, that the dreaming tracks are still there under the water, still running in the ancient directions, connecting things that the surface of the world has separated. Number 33. What the tide knows, rhythm and memory in coastal traditions. The tides are the heartbeat of the coast. Every coastal people in the world has developed an understanding of the tides, because tides determine so much of what is available when. The reef that is accessible at low tide, the fish that feed in the shallows only during specific tidal phases, the estuaries where the best shellfish can be gathered only when the tide has pulled back far enough to expose the right banks, the crossing points that are safe only at low water. Aboriginal Australian coastal peoples have developed, over tens of thousands of years, some of the most sophisticated tidal knowledge systems in the world. Not just the basic cycle of high and low tide, but the complex variations in tidal height and timing across different seasons, the way tidal patterns shift through the lunar month, the specific behavior of local tidal flows in particular bays and estuaries, the way different species of marine life respond to tidal cycles in specific locations. This knowledge is not abstract. It is practical, daily, life-saving. Knowing exactly when a particular reef will be exposed and for how long determines whether you can gather the particular species of sea urchin that is only accessible there. Knowing the precise tidal rhythm of a particular channel determines whether you can cross it safely on foot or need a different route. Knowing the seasonal tidal patterns determines when to set particular kinds of fish traps for maximum effectiveness. The tidal knowledge of coastal Aboriginal Australians has been encoded in stories and songs and ceremony in the same way that all other crucial knowledge is encoded. The tidal rhythms of specific places appear in the cadence of particular songs. The timing of specific fishing activities appears in the structure of particular ceremonies. The knowledge is embedded in cultural forms that make it memorable, transmissible, and reliable. And this tidal knowledge carries within it the memory of tidal patterns that no longer apply. As the sea rose and the coast changed, the tidal regimes of specific locations changed too. A bay that once had a particular tidal rhythm developed a different one as it deepened, and as the topography of the surrounding seafloor changed. A river estuary that had a specific tidal character altered as the saltwater intrusion extended further upstream. The cultural encoding of these changed tidal patterns represents another layer of the flood's memory. Not just the memory of where the coast was, but the memory of how the water moved when it was there. The rhythm of the ancient tide, preserved in the rhythm of a song. Number 34. Walking the country underwater, dive archaeology, and the living seabed. There is a moment when you first descend below the surface of the sea in a place where the seafloor was once dry land, where the two realities of the place exist simultaneously in your mind. You are in the ocean, you are also, in a very real sense, walking on land that has been flooded. The seafloor of the shallow Sahul shelf has this quality of doubled reality. The topography is too shaped, too structured, too varied in the wrong ways for sediment-covered ocean floor to be just sediment-covered ocean floor. The shapes are the shapes of land. The ridgelines run in patterns that reflect ancient drainage. The depressions are too regular, too oriented to be random. When archaeologists make careful, controlled dives in strategically selected areas of this seafloor, they sometimes find things that confirm the doubled reality. Stone tools. These are not objects that fall from boats. They are not washed out from the modern coast in significant numbers. They are made of the kinds of stone found in the inland areas of the now submerged shelf, not in the modern coastal zone. They are of types that belong to the archaeological periods of the ancient occupation of that shelf. Finding a stone tool on the seafloor of the Sahul shelf is finding an object that was last held by a human hand before the water came. That hand, and the person it belonged to, and the world they lived in, have been gone for 10,000 years or more. The tool sank to the seafloor, not when someone dropped it in the water, but when the water rose to cover the ground where someone had left it. The encounter between a diver and that ancient tool, in the dim light under 50 meters of ocean, is an encounter across an enormous gulf of time. The tool speaks of a world utterly different from the one the diver inhabits. It speaks of dry land, dry air, the smell of grass and fire, and the particular quality of light in the late afternoon on a flat plain. It speaks of a person who needed it, made it, used it, set it down for a moment, and never came back for it because the world they lived in was being swallowed by water and they had to move. Dive archaeology in the shallow seas of Australia is beginning to document these encounters systematically. Survey grids are laid out on the seafloor. Finds are mapped with GPS precision. The sediment is sampled for pollen and organic material that might tell us what grew in this place when it was above water. The underwater topography is recorded in fine detail. Slowly, grid by square grid, dive by dive, the lost world of the Sahul Shelf is being mapped and documented. It is the slowest archaeology in the world, but it is also, in some ways, the most extraordinary. The sites are untouched by agriculture, by construction, by the thousand disturbances that surface sites experience over thousands of years. The water has been a rough preserver in some ways and a gentle one in others. What is there, in some cases, has been remarkably well kept by the cold, dark, low oxygen conditions of the deep sea floor. The ancient world is there, under the water, and we are, slowly, carefully, with great respect, beginning to read it. Number 35. The stars above the drowned land, Aboriginal astronomy and the memory of place. Aboriginal Australians developed over tens of thousands of years, one of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge systems in the world. Not just knowledge of the stars and planets, though that knowledge was and is extraordinarily detailed, but a way of integrating astronomical knowledge with ecological knowledge, with seasonal cycles, with the behavior of animals and the ripening of plants, that produced a unified system for navigating both the sky above and the land below. The night sky in this system is not just a map of the heavens, it is also a map of the earth. The patterns of stars in different parts of the sky correspond to different features of the landscape. Following certain star paths leads you, on the ground, along certain routes through country. The rising and setting of specific stars signal specific times of year when specific ecological events occur, when certain fish are running, when certain plant foods are ripe, when certain animals can be found in certain places. This integration of sky and land extends to the relationship between specific stars and specific places on the ground. In some traditions, certain stars are said to be connected to certain water holes or certain sacred sites. The star is the sky expression of the place. The place is the ground expression of the star. They are aspects of the same dreaming reality, manifested in different registers of the world. When the sea rose and covered the Sahul plain, the stars above it did not change. The sky map remained the same. The dreaming tracks that had been mapped in both the sky and the land continued to exist in the sky, even after the land component was underwater. This means that in the astronomical traditions of the peoples who lost country to the flood, the ancient landscape is still present in the sky. The stars that corresponded to places on the Sahul plain still shine. The sky paths that led across the ancient terrain are still visible on clear nights. The astronomical knowledge that encoded the geography of a drowned world is still being transmitted, because the sky that it refers to has not changed. When an elder of a northern Australian coastal community teaches a young person the star knowledge, pointing out the stars that correspond to specific dreaming places, some of those dreaming places may be underwater. The landscape they point to may be the seafloor. But the knowledge is still valid, still real, still transmissible, because the sky it is encoded in is still there above everyone's head. The flood took the land, it did not take the sky, and the sky has held the memory of the land through all the years since. There is something in this that is worth sitting with quietly in the darkness before sleep. The idea that what is lost on the ground can still be present in the sky, that the stars carry in their ancient positions and their ancient names the geography of worlds that the earth has forgotten. That the night sky is, in some traditions, a library of lost landscapes, a map of places that exist now only in the light of distant suns. Look up, if you can, from wherever you're reading this. The stars that are above you now were above the Sahul plain when people walked on it 12,000 years ago. They burned then exactly as they burn now. And the people who lived on that ancient plain looked up at them and named them and connected them to their world and passed that knowledge down through every generation until it reached the people who carry it today. The stars remember. They always have. Number 36. The long count, understanding deep time through the flood. There is a way of thinking about time that the ancient flood makes suddenly very vivid. A way of feeling the length of 12,000 years, not as an abstraction, but as something almost physically present. 12,000 years ago, agriculture had not been invented anywhere on Earth. The oldest cities in the world did not yet exist. Writing was still 8,000 years in the future. The great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley in China were still 6,000 to 8,000 years away from their beginnings. All of recorded human history, all of it, every war and empire and invention and artwork and philosophical system and political revolution that we have any written record of fits inside the last 6,000 years. And the flood that changed Australia happened at least 6,000 years before the oldest written record. The people who stood on the shores of the Sahul Plain as the sea rose were our contemporaries in biological terms. They were anatomically modern humans, fully capable of everything we are capable of, with the same range of emotion and intelligence and creativity and social complexity that we have. They were not primitive, they were not simple, they were people, living in a world being transformed around them, doing what people do, adapting, surviving, making meaning, carrying their experience forward in the forms available to them. And yet the distance between their world and ours is almost incomprehensible. Not in biological terms, not in cognitive terms, but in terms of the sheer passage of time, of the layers of change that have accumulated between their moment and ours. The gulf is vast. 12,000 years is 500 generations. If you could shake the hand of your parent, and they could shake the hand of their parent and so on, 500 times, the person at the end of that chain of handshakes would have watched the Sahul flood. They would have stood on ground that is now ocean floor. They would have spoken a language that has no modern descendant, perhaps, or one that has changed so much in 500 generations that it would be completely unrecognizable. 500 generations, 500 times the distance between a grandchild and a grandparent, 500 times the personal, intimate, physical connection of hands touched, and faces known and stories told around a common fire. And the stories survived. Across all 500 of those generational gaps, something was preserved. Not everything, of course not everything, but something essential, something true enough and important enough and carefully enough kept, that 12,000 years later, the geological record can confirm what the stories say. That is the measure of what the Aboriginal Australian peoples preserved. Not 500 years, not 1,000 years, not even 3,000 or 4,000 years. The span of most ancient written records. 500 generations. 12,000 years. The length of all of recorded human history. Twice over. It is the greatest act of cultural preservation in human history. And it happened without writing, without formal institutions, without libraries or archives, or any of the technological apparatus we normally associate with long-term record keeping. It happened through voice and memory and the sacred obligation to carry what matters forward to those who come after. As you close towards sleep now, let that number settle in you. 12,000 years, 500 generations. The length of the flood in the lives of the people who survived it and remembered it. And then let it go. Let it drift away into the dark, the way numbers always do when sleep comes. What remains when the number is gone is something simpler and more real. The sense of a very long time. And somewhere in that long time, a story being told, and told again, and told again, until it reaches this night, this darkness, and you. Number 37. The shape of the country now, reading the modern landscape for signs of the ancient world. You can see the flood if you know how to look. Drive north from Darwin toward Arnhem Land, and the landscape you pass through is full of the flood's fingerprints. The flat floodplains that extend for kilometers from the base of the stone escarpments are the legacy of the sea's retreat, the accumulated sediments of thousands of years of post-flood river deposition. The paperbark swamps in the low ground are living in ecosystems that exist because the land was once marine environment, and the soil chemistry still reflects that history. The salt pans that glitter white in the dry season are places where the sea has not entirely left, where salt deposited in the marine phase still works its way to the surface. Stand on top of one of the stone escarpments that edge the Arnhem Land Plateau and look north. The flat country stretching out toward the horizon is the ancient Sahul Shelf, raised slightly by geological processes over millennia, but still bearing the imprint of its long submergence. The rivers that drain northward from the escarpment are still following routes established before the flood, routes that their ancestors on the Sahul shelf followed before the sea came. The modern landscape of coastal northern Australia is a palimpsest, a manuscript written over and over again, with the older writing still showing through the new. You can see, if you look carefully, the shapes of the ancient coast in the way the escarpments face the sea. You can see the old river channels in the way the modern rivers course through the floodplains. You can see the marine inundation in the chemistry of the soil and the ecology of the wetlands. The flood is written in the landscape, you just have to learn the alphabet. In the south, around the edges of the Murray-Darling Basin, you can see a different kind of inscription. The ancient lake systems, now dry, leave their mark in the circular outlines of old shorelines preserved in the slightly raised rim of sediment that formed around the water's edge. Lake Mungo itself, now a dry lunette of windblown sand, preserves in its pale curves the shape of a lake that existed for 40,000 years and has been dry for 15,000. The Willandra Lake system, of which Lake Mungo is part, is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for both its natural significance and its extraordinary cultural heritage. The dunes and deflated clay surfaces of the dry lake system still yield, occasionally, the remains of the ancient Australians who lived on its shores, the most ancient burial sites on the continent, evidence of a people living rich and ceremonially complex lives on the shores of a lake that is now sand and memory. The landscape tells the story, for those who know how to read it, and the people who have always known how to read it, whose traditional knowledge is a centuries-old education in exactly this kind of landscape reading, carry the most complete version of the story, not the geological story only, not the ecological story only, but the full human story of the places and what they meant and what happened to them and who lived there and why it mattered. That knowledge is still being maintained, still being taught, still being passed from those who know to those who need to know, in the traditional country management practices that are becoming increasingly recognized as sophisticated land management systems, in the fire management that maintains the health of particular ecosystems, in the ceremony and the song that keeps the dreaming relationships alive between people and country. The flood shaped this landscape, and the people have been reading it and tending it and knowing it ever since. Number 38. Between sleep and waking, the ancient shore at the edge of dreams. There is a particular state of consciousness that exists just before deep sleep, when the boundary between waking thought and dreaming begins to dissolve. The technical name for it is the hypnagogic state. In folk traditions around the world, it has many other names, many other descriptions. The place where visions come. The doorway, the thin time. In some Aboriginal Australian traditions, this edge between waking and dreaming is considered significant. It is a time when the dreaming is closer to the surface of experience, when the deeper reality that underlies the everyday world becomes briefly, partially visible to those who know how to see it. I am not asking you to believe anything in particular about this, but I am inviting you to notice, if you are approaching sleep now, the quality of that edge state. The loosening of the boundaries of the ordinary world, the way images can form without being consciously constructed, the sense of being in a place that is not quite the room you're lying in, and not quite somewhere else. And if, in that state, you find yourself somewhere flat and open, somewhere that smells of grass and distant water, somewhere that extends further than the eye can see under a sky enormous and star-thick and old, do not be alarmed. You may simply be resting in the shape of the ancient world, in the geography that underlies the geography we know, in the Sahul plain that still exists in some dimension beneath the Arafura Sea. It is, by all accounts, a large and open country, the kind of country that opens something in a person who has only ever lived in closed, defined, bounded spaces, the kind of country that makes you understand, viscerally, what it must have felt like to lose it. To watch it go under the water, square kilometer by square kilometer, season by season, generation by generation, until the country that had been everything was gone, and then to carry it, in story and song and ceremony, in the particular way that certain words feel in your mouth when you say them, the words for water in its many forms, the words for country in all its meanings, the words that remember a landscape that the physical world no longer holds. That is the sleep that this story is carrying you toward. Not a blank unconsciousness, but a rest that has within it the depth of deep time, the vast, peaceful expanse of a world that existed before the flood changed it, present still in the layers of memory and tradition that are among the most extraordinary achievements of the human species. Sleep now. The ancient shore is there, if you look for it, in the deep country of dream, and the water that covers it is warm and gentle. And the story is still being told, and you are part of the telling of it because you listen tonight, and listening is how the story travels, from voice to ear to memory to voice again, across all the generations that will ever exist between the flood and the morning. Number 39. The gift of the lost world, what the drowned continent gave the world. Loss is not only loss. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and it should not be said in a way that minimizes what was lost when the Sahul plain went under the sea. The loss was real. The animals, the habitats, the cultural connections to specific country, the places of ceremony and burial and daily life, all of this was real and all of it was lost. But the process of loss and the response to it also gave things to the world that would not have existed without it. The oral traditions of coastal flooding that Aboriginal Australians developed and maintained are now, in the 21st century, among the most important data sets we have for understanding the history of global sea level rise. They are being used by geologists and oceanographers to calibrate models of ancient coastal change. They are helping to locate archaeological sites that would otherwise be unknown. They are providing a human dimension to the history of the post-glacial sea level rise that purely geological data cannot provide. The cultural diversity of Australia, that extraordinary mosaic of languages and traditions and knowledge systems, which is in part a product of the mixing and displacement of the flood period, is itself a gift. The range of different ways of knowing the Australian environment that developed across hundreds of distinct cultural groups represents a breadth of ecological intelligence that no single tradition could have generated. Different groups developed deep expertise in different environments, different species, different seasonal patterns, different ecological relationships. Together, that body of knowledge is among the richest ecological knowledge systems ever developed by human beings anywhere on Earth. The Great Barrier Reef, which grew in the waters that swallowed the ancient coastal plain, is a gift to the world on a different scale entirely. The largest living structure on Earth, the ecosystem that supports hundreds of thousands of species, the cultural and economic resource that defines the identity of coastal Queensland, all of it grew from the flooding. The sea that took the Sahul plain gave the world the reef. The genetic diversity of Aboriginal Australian populations, that rich and complex pattern of variation shaped by thousands of years of separation and mixing during and after the flood period, is a record of human history that geneticists are only beginning to fully explore. It holds within it information about the early peopling of the continent, the timing and roots of human movement through Sahul, the nature of population structure in the ancient world, information that is found nowhere else on Earth, and the flood itself as a story, as a historical event recorded in the oral traditions of the world's oldest living culture, is a gift to the understanding of what the end of the Ice Age meant for the people who lived through it. The great transformation of the post-glacial world is not an abstract geological event. It is a human event, with human voices still attached to it, still describing it, still naming the places where the water came and the ground where the people stood when it arrived. Number 40. The weight of water sitting quietly with what the sea carries. Water carries things. This is not a metaphor, though it can be that too. Water carries things in the most literal and physical sense. It carries silt and seeds and nutrients, and the dissolved minerals that make certain soils fertile and certain soils barren. It carries heat from the tropics toward the poles and cold from the poles back. It carries oxygen into the depths where sunlight never reaches, keeping alive the creatures that live in perpetual darkness. Water carries the world's chemistry in solution, distributing it from where it is produced to where it is needed, keeping the enormous machine of planetary life running with a quiet efficiency that we rarely stop to notice. And water carries memory, not in any mystical sense, despite what various popular ideas about water suggest. The memory that water carries is a physical memory, written in the sediments it deposits, in the chemical signatures it leaves in the rocks it touches, in the organisms that live within it and die within it and sink to the bottom, and become part of the record of what was. The ocean floor is a library. The sediment cores that scientists drill from its depths are texts in a language that takes years to learn to read, a language of microscopic shells and pollen grains and chemical ratios and isotopic signatures, a language that, when read correctly, tells the story of every climate the Earth has passed through in the past hundreds of millions of years. The water that covers the Sahul Shelf carries, in its chemistry and its sediments, the memory of the flooding. The layers of sediment on the ocean floor there encode, in their chemistry, the transition from land to sea. The pollen that settled into those sediments when the land was dry and grassy is different from the pollen that settled when it was shallow marine. The microscopic marine organisms that appeared when the sea arrived are absent from the layers below, where the freshwater organisms of the old lakes and rivers tell a different story. All of this is there, waiting to be read by those who know how, and it corresponds in its broad outlines and in many of its details with what the oral traditions of the people who lived through the flooding describe. The stories match the sediments, the voices match the chemistry, the memory that people carried in their traditions and the memory that water carried in its sediments are, in this case, saying the same thing. That convergence is one of the most remarkable things I know about the history of science and the history of human culture. Two completely different ways of remembering, human oral tradition and physical sedimentary record, both preserving the same event across the same vast stretch of time and meeting each other in the present with enough correlation to confirm that both are telling the truth. The water carries the memory, the people carry the memory, and together, in the careful work of researchers who take both seriously, the memory becomes knowledge. The ancient event becomes a documented history. The flood that changed Australia 12,000 years ago becomes not just a geological episode, but a human story, complete with the texture of experience and the weight of meaning that only human memory can provide. As you settle now into the last moments before sleep, let that image be the one that carries you. The water and the people, both carrying the same memory. The sediment and the story, both saying the same thing. The ancient world preserved in two different forms, meeting in the present after 12,000 years apart, recognizing each other across the enormous distance of time. The flood happened, it was real, people were there, and the memory of it is still here, held by the water and held by the people who survived it. That is enough, more than enough. Sleep gently now, the ancient water is all around, and the story is safe. Number 41, the last story, a voice across the water. Imagine a voice. Not a voice you can hear with your ears, but a voice you can feel in the way a story settles into you when it is true and old and carefully kept. A voice that has been speaking for 12,000 years, passing through thousands of mouths and thousands of ears, shaping itself to the needs of each generation while holding its essential truth unchanged. This voice is describing a place. It is describing the place in the way that only someone who has loved a place for a very long time can describe it. Not as a set of geographical features, though the features are there, exact and accurate enough to confirm the geological record, but as a presence, as a living reality, as a country that is known in the way that a person is known, intimately, with all the knowledge that comes from long attention and deep love. The voice describes the way the light falls on the flat plain in the evening, when the shadows grow long and the sky turns colors that do not have names in any language that is spoken today. It describes the particular sound that a certain kind of grass makes in a certain kind of wind. It describes the smell of the fresh water when the river is running strongly after rain that has come from somewhere far away, from the high places that are still above water, still feeding the rivers that cross this plain toward a sea that is still, for now, far away. The voice knows that the water is coming. It has been coming for as long as anyone can remember. The elders said it when they were young, and the elders who taught them said it when they were young, and so on back to a time when the memory of the water's first coming was still fresh. The water comes, and the country shrinks, and the people move, and the songs change to include the new country even as they hold the memory of the old. This is the voice that has been speaking all evening, through all the items of this long list, through all the stories and the science and the careful accumulation of a picture of a world that most of the world has forgotten. You have been hearing it, whether you knew it or not. And now the voice is quieter, not gone. It is never gone, but quieter, the way voices become in the deep hours of the night when the fire has burned down, and the last of the stories have been told, and the people who have been sitting together begin to drift toward the warmth of sleep. The country is out there, under the water, still real, still shaped the way it was shaped when the voice first described it, still holding, in the structure of its drowned hills and valleys and river courses, the geography of a world that the sea took, and the voice is still there too, still describing it, still naming the places with the names they were given when there was breath and light and the smell of grass instead of the cold pressure of deep water. Listen as you fall asleep. You might hear it, the voice across the ancient water, telling the story one more time. Good night. There is one more thing worth saying before we are done. The people who carried this story across 12,000 years did not do it for us. They did not know we would be here, in this age, with our satellites and our genome sequences and our ocean floor survey vessels, needing their testimony to confirm what the sediments were already saying. They carried the story because the story was true, and because the country it described was theirs. And because the ancestors who were buried in that country deserve to be remembered, and because the people who would come after them, their own children and grandchildren, and all the generations stretching forward into a future they could not see, deserve to know where they came from and what had happened to the world that made them. They carried it, because that is what you do with something true and important and precious. You carry it, you tend it, you pass it on. And in doing so, across 12,000 years and 500 generations, they gave the rest of the world something none of the rest of the world had managed to keep: a living, accurate, geographically specific memory of the end of the last ice age, a human record of the greatest sea level event in the human story, a testimony to the experience of a people standing at the edge of a world that was being swallowed by water and choosing in that moment of enormous loss to remember. We are the beneficiaries of that choice. Every one of us who has listened tonight to the story of the ancient flood, who has let the image of the Sahul plain settle into the quiet of the mind before sleep, who has felt something of the weight and the wonder of 12,000 years of faithful telling, we are the beneficiaries. Thank you for listening. The story thanks you. The voice across the water thanks you. And now, at last, the silence. Good night. If this sleep journey through Australia's ancient past brought you some peace tonight, please consider subscribing. Every week, new slow histories from the deep past of our world, told gently, made for the quiet hours, designed to carry you across the water and into the country of dreams. Thank you for spending this time with the oldest story, and good night